listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for one of the last editions this year, the last edition this week, certainly, of the most disruptive show covering news, events, and politics across our divided states as well as across the divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, Merry Christmas Eve, folks, and or Happy Holidays, whichever you prefer. Not trying to be excluding folks here. Anyway, getting into the headlines. You know what? I'll just do this right up front. We're not going to be on the air tomorrow. This is our last day of the show this week. We're also going to be off the air next Friday, this Friday and next Friday. You know, it's Christmas Day, New Year's Day. So those are federal holidays in the U.S. Just top of the morning to you, just letting you know. Anyway, in the news, in the headlines this morning, updated yesterday at noon 30 at 12:30 p.m., the CDC COVID tracker reported over 18,170,000 total COVID cases in the U.S. and 321,734 total deaths, including 3,165 new deaths. California has become the first state to hit 2 million COVID cases. This came just 6 weeks after hitting the 1 million case mark. More than 23,500 Californians have died from the virus since the pandemic began. Because of the COVID lockdowns, states around the U.S. are facing steep deficits and little federal aid in sight. The shift to remote work could give many cash-strapped states a legitimate way to bring back much-needed tax revenue. So a group of states joined a U.S. Supreme Court battle that could determine whether jurisdictions can tax the income of remote workers who are no longer commuting to the office. New Jersey, along with Connecticut, Hawaii, and Iowa, submitted an amicus brief on Tuesday in a lawsuit that challenges the authority of states to tax non-residents' income while they've been working from home. At the center of the controversy is a court case between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The Bay State has been taxing New Hampshire residents who have been working remotely since the pandemic, spurring the Granite State to file suit against Massachusetts in October. New Jersey's brief supports New Hampshire's position. The brief also pushes back on New York, which taxes Garden State residents who normally commute there, even though many are now working from home. So there's an interstate scuffle going on over tax rights right now. In national political news, yesterday Trump pardoned 26 more people and commuted sentences of 3 more people. The list includes former campaign chair Paul Manafort, convicted of financial fraud and conspiring to obstruct the investigation of his crimes. Longtime friend Roger Stone, whose clemency was upgraded to a full pardon, convicted during the Mueller investigation. Charles Kushner, father of Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who pled guilty to making false statements to the Federal Election Commission, witness tampering, and tax evasion. James Kassouf, guilty of filing a false tax return in 1989. Mary McCarthy, a former Florida County Commissioner, guilty of honest services fraud in 2009. Christopher Wade, who was convicted of cybercrimes. Christopher Anthony Bryant, a community leader in Kentucky, guilty of federal cocaine offenses. Cesar Lozada, an immigrant from Cuba, guilty of conspiring to distribute marijuana. Joseph Martin Stevens, guilty of being a felon in possession of a firearm. Andrew Barron Warden, an entrepreneur convicted of wire fraud. Robert Coughlin, guilty of conflict of interest in performing his duties as a Department of Justice official. John Boltsby and Peter Atkinson, both convicted of mail fraud. Joseph Occhipinti, former supervisory special agent with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, who is convicted of conspiracy to violate civil laws under the color of law and making false statements, and quite a few more. Quite a few we've listed here, but there are even more. If we spent more time on this, that would be our headlines. And frankly, there are more to get to. Speaking of which, in international political news, calls for Julian Assange to be pardoned by U.S. President Donald Trump are on the rise nationally and internationally, with activists, journalists, writers, campaigners, and politicians from across the ideological spectrum demanding that the WikiLeaks publisher be freed during the final days of the current administration. German legislators have formed the Free Julian Assange Working Group amid growing calls for the WikiLeaks publisher to be pardoned by U.S. President Donald Trump. Christian Meir of Reporters Without Borders, which has been monitoring Assange's extradition hearings, announced the formation of the cross-party group in the Bundestag on 21st of December, 2020. The letter says that the working group was founded, quote, out of great concern for the life of journalist and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who has been in solitary confinement and in critical condition for over 18 months at the high-security Belmarsh prison in the UK, and whose extradition to the US is to be decided upon on the 4th of January 2021. It's coming up pretty quick here, folks. End quote. Well, that last part was definitely not part of the original quotation mark. Just a big quick. Anyway, Assange's mother, who recently announced that she would stop using social media for her own good, nonetheless took to Twitter to thank the MPs and others for all their hard work on the issue. The announcement from Germany comes at the same time that a group of Australian MPs and senators signed an open letter to President Trump calling on him to either pardon Assange or drop the prosecution case against him. Quote, Assange has fought for truth and justice. His work with WikiLeaks has pioneered accountability by the media and exposed corruption, civil liberties violations in the United States and around the world, and the true cost of war. End quote. The politicians, again, wrote that in the open letter, the signed open letter from Australian MPs and senators to President Trump. Over in the UK, changing headlines here, Boris Johnson is to address his nation on Thursday morning as the UK and the EU are set to be close to clinching a Brexit deal. The agreement will let the UK trade freely with the EU without tariffs or quotas. Chief spokesman of the European Commission, Eric Mamer, said earlier that the European Union and the United Kingdom will continue the work on the post-Brexit trade agreement throughout the night, as media reports suggested that the deal could be reached in the early hours of Thursday. London had made significant concessions in the talks, including on the stumbling fishery issues within the past 24 hours. We were talking about that with Alexander Mercouris recently, a French and British squabble over who gets fishing rights, which is near and dear to your average Brit's heart, with fish and chips and whatnot. Anyway, not to typecast here. Earlier, the EU Council had begun the procedure for preparing for the implementation of a potential trade agreement with the UK, which should come into force on the 1st of January, but only if the European Parliament and the British Parliament have time to ratify it between Christmas and New Year. If London and Brussels find no common ground by the end of the year, by the 31st of December, the UK will no longer be under the EU's trade rules. And the World Trade Organization's rules will come into effect for both sides in 2021, including customs tariffs and full border checks for goods flowing across the English Channel. Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney said there had been, quote, some sort of last-minute hitch, end quote, over the small print of the fishing quotas agreement, but a deal was still expected later. Rolling on our last international headline, at least on my bill, an anti-monopoly investigation has been initiated against Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba Group, the State Administration for Market Regulation said on Thursday. I'm going to quote here. In accordance with the received complaint, the State Administration for Market Regulation, in accordance with the received complaint, has initiated an investigation against Alibaba Company on suspicion of a monopoly. End quote. Ma's offer did not help to salvage the IPO since Beijing was angered by his criticism of the government's excessive regulations in the national finance industry, which he viewed as a major obstacle for the growth of new financial services and innovations. Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly personally ordered Chinese regulators to study possible risks posed by Ant Group and suspend the IPO. Co-founder of Alibaba Group, Jack Ma, offered to hand over parts of his financial technology giant Ant Group to the Chinese government in an attempt to save the company's initial public offering, or IPO, that was suspended by the Shanghai Stock Exchange on the 3rd of November. And with that, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know what, Jamarl? I'm going to turn it over to you. We went over a lot of stuff there. 26 more pardons from the president. Julian Assange notably not on that list. And the stimulus bill, after Trump vetoed that, along with the NDAA, other federal spending, going back for rewrite. We're in an interesting time. And, it's Christmas Eve. Happy Christmas Eve. Merry Christmas Eve, man.
Merry Christmas,
What
man.
do you think?
It is very bizarre politics where we are. So to make it that much more acute, you have a situation where the Democratic Party, after screaming that $2.2 trillion was the only thing they could accept, are now saying they want $900 billion. Not just saying we're willing to accept it, but are out there fighting for it, and gone farther with Kamala Harris attacking all of these Democrats on message, saying less is more. Have you seen this? Amy Klobuchar, you've had Mark Warner, you've had the people on MSNBC and CNN basically saying, oh, this is not a moment to waste. Not a moment to waste. We must put the money out now. And it's like all of these people all of a sudden has gotten exactly on message. And Donald Trump is basically saying the American public should get $2,000, which means that the Democratic Party establishment has basically lined up fighting for less money, including Kamala Harris, who at one point pushed for $2,000. Isn't that sad? That's so sad.
It's remarkable.
That's so sad.
Full court press for austerity.
Yeah, right. Right. That's it. Full court press for austerity. The American public doesn't deserve $2,000. We need to give these people less. I just find it to be phenomenal. And that's the Democratic Party. Like, that's not, it's the Republican in this bunch that's fighting for America. That's so bizarre. And then you think to yourself, we just had a primary. And with everything that's going on around the world, you would think that the pressure would be to go big. Just because everything that's going on. I mean, how many, every time you have, let's say, I always say a crisis is an opportune moment to get something done. For the left or right, it just means you get something done. It's agnostic in regards to what you get done. It just means something's on fire. The excuse that you use to solve that fire is whatever idea you had anyway, that nobody else wanted. So it's like, hey, I have this great idea that none of you guys liked in this other moment, but in this moment, this is a perfect solution. Which is kind of my point. If the Democrats believed in anything, COVID would have been the time to do it. Because this was a perfect
Why do you think
excuse.
they're not doing this? Why do you think they're not? Why do you think there is this full court press? Just very simply, do you think it's fears over inflation? What do you think is the
I think it's
cause
as simple
here?
as Joe Biden basically told them to accept less, and all of them fall in line to accept less for the new president. I think it's that straightforward. I mean, they said in the New York Times, Biden was instrumental in the negotiations, and he was instrumental in having Democrats with the confidence of saying they could accept less. He probably told them, hey, accept less. It's okay. In which case, all of them start fighting for less. All of them gets on the same page. Nobody wants to countermand the president. In fact, even more importantly, no one wants to make it look as if the president is weak. Meaning, if Kamala Harris comes out for $2,000, she undermines Biden. If Pelosi comes out for $2,000, she undermines Biden. All of them are doing a full court press purely for tribal political reasons. America doesn't factor into this conversation. It's that sad. I honestly believe it's that straightforward. Because up to this point, Pelosi was pushing for $2.2 trillion. She said that was, this was what we had to accept. We couldn't accept anything less. And then a day after Biden, well, all of a sudden, not just $1.8 trillion is sufficient, but half of what she said was insufficient is now perfectly adequate and great. And by the way, that wasn't even going to include a stimulus check at all. It was only after Harley and Sanders went into the Senate and made us think about it. And so it's like, I get people have this idea that these guys are working to your best interests, but I don't buy that. I mean, at the end of the day, it seems that America is undeserving of health care. America is undeserving of life. America is undeserving of education where they don't have to pay $50,000 on their back. And even after the bailing out of Wall Street, after the trillions that are given over the decades to oligarchs, do you realize they gave tax cuts and then turned around and put those tax cuts on the back of American workers under the Trump administration with a fig leaf that, well, the people who are in Congress later on are never going to let those go through, those tax increases go through. But the fact is, they put them through anyway. That's kind of my point. It seems that in every situation, the wealth of the nation is attended to, and attended to monstrously and radically. But when it comes down to the American public itself, moral hazard is always thrown out. Moral hazard, moral hazard. It seems that they care less about the American public, and they care more about these oligarchs. And I'm saying we are the people who make this country run, and the attention needs to be given to us. And at some point, we need to realize that. This pretending as if these guys are working in our interests. I'm sorry, they're not. And this idea that Democrats are somehow, the party that's working for the working man. Nonsense. You have a Republican that's trying to give $2,000 to the American public. That guy just lost the race. And the guy that won the race is basically saying give less and was perfectly okay with giving nothing. Yeah, okay, let's do this. Let's take the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can also send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. I don't entirely have an overtly long monologue today. In fact, we probably could even push this back and forth, but I do kind of want to make just a basic comment on something that is taking place that we as Americans should be outraged over. Just because something happens that you believe may be in the interests of your country doesn't necessarily mean it's in the interests of your country. There are things that happen that go beyond just the individual, let's say, win and loss. That goes beyond to a larger context. And things maybe not necessarily have meanings from a universal standpoint because it doesn't care, but from a human contextual standpoint, it should matter, especially if America means anything at all. We have all of these people that were being locked up. Kiriakou gets imprisoned for revealing the torture stuff. Again, monstrous stuff that is supposed to be against our laws. And yet, he wasn't a sufficient whistleblower. He was prosecuted. Chelsea Manning revealing the murder of a Reuters agent, not to mention the behavior of our troops in Iraq, making the point that says, look, I thought that we were here to do good, and what we're doing is not necessarily doing good. Prison, torture, and prison. Snowden reveals mass surveillance all across the United States. Basically, again, illegal. Clapper lies saying that this is not taking place. There's no mass surveillance in the United States. Lies to Congress. And yet, Clapper walks. Roger Stone, who, yes, is a crook. Yes, you can call him a henchman. But by the same token, he did the exact same thing with lesser value. Meaning him lying to put himself in the middle of a case. Him lying about being part of the Russiagate nonsense and all this other stuff. And then the lie was that he wasn't anything. He wasn't part of it at all. And they prosecuted him for that lie. They descended upon his house like a compound and they grabbed him and took him away. And the media, who employ psychics, were there with their cameras and their lights on. This is not a rah-rah Stone. It's making the point that the device to which we accrue around, this governmental structure, should not be used for political ends or to score political wins. And I don't know what that was if it wasn't to basically score a political win. Clapper walks, doesn't even get a second look. Brennan walks, lies to Congress, doesn't even get a second look. It's amazing to me that some people seem to be in the clear and pardonable, and not just pardonable, not even brought up for charges, when others are always brought up for charges. Meaning, when Clinton walks, If that was anybody else, when Comey gave that long speech, if that was anybody else, the end of that speech would have been perp walked. Clinton, however, walks. I am making the point that there seems to be a clear distinction for some of us as opposed to others. There seems to be two different tiers of justice. And what I want to point out is that those two tiers of justice get across something that goes beyond just the individual instance that it occurs. What does it mean to be an American? Are we under the rule of law? Do we care about life? Do we care about freedom and democracy? Do we care about holding people accountable when they do a particular crime, especially the people at the top, the people who have every impetus in the world to commit those crimes if they can get away with it, who can advantage themselves because of their great stature? Do we have any sort of thing where the rule of law matters to all of us, or does it only matter to some of us? Personally, I think it's the latter. I think it only matters to some of us. I think if you're leaking on somebody who power dislikes, you're always going to be safe. If you're leaking on somebody that doesn't necessarily, let's say for political ends, that hits this particular guy who's not that popular, you will be okay. If you leak something that exposes waste, fraud, abuse, malfeasance of a state or some kind of institutional power, you're screwed. The whistleblower laws are not going to protect you. I want to detail all that because I kind of want to point out the people who were in prison for things that they did that were noble and should have been protected by laws versus things that weren't. I wanted to show the distinction between those things. Added to all of this is Donald Trump. People have been pushing Donald Trump to pardon Snowden. Snowden himself, selfless, push they pardon Julian Assange. Sarah Palin comes out for Julian Assange. People around the world has come out for pardon for Julian Assange. And of anybody, it is the weirdest thing in the world that we expect him to be held by our laws, but not protected by our laws. So yes, we could go after him, but the laws that would protect a particular publisher apparently doesn't necessarily apply. Only the laws that can go after him. That is a slippery slope. And I understand that all of these people who are Democrats in the woke crowd hates Julian Assange, but you may want to pay attention to the fact that that's a slippery slope that can easily set the precedent to going after you, that is also publishers. Donald Trump the other day put a slew of pardons, not for people who deserve those pardons, not for people who was putting stuff out that was in pursuit of trying to have a fairer and more honest, decent America. No, he did the opposite. Donald Trump let go a mass murderer, literal mass murderer, who was murdering for America. Now, it behooves America to punish that person because the last thing you want is somebody in another country murdering on behalf of America. But that is literally what was taking place. He was prosecuted. He should have been prosecuted. He should have been thrown under the jail. And yet, Donald Trump comes out and lets him go. The president, this is Washington Post, the president has pardoned 4 contractors convicted of first-degree murder on manslaughter in Baghdad's Nisquire Square made few headlines in Iraq. Often, it met with fatigue or cynicism, briefly surprising, but not unexpected. And for lots of Iraqis, it seems only a restatement of their decades-long experience with American power. Meaning, this guy being a homicidal killer, his friends and him being let off, from their standpoint, is not even surprising because their idea of what America is probably more honest. Why wouldn't it be more honest? They're at the boot of this country. They're not sitting here in the capital of the country itself, like in Hunger Games, where everybody is kind of looking like peacocks and everything else. This is the border regions where the borders of the empire, where law, order, those things break down, especially for the individuals that is in the country to which we are invading. 1 million Iraqis died in that. Do you believe the 1 million Iraqis died? All of them died because, for good reasons. We never killed a man that didn't deserve it. No, it's a war zone. And we have these people in this country with all sorts of power, with very little accountability. That accountability became that much less. To put this in perspective, one of the people that Donald Trump, right here, one of the contractors pardoned Wednesday by Trump, Nicholas Sladden, was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder after being convicted for his role in the killings of 14 unarmed Iraqis in a shooting rampage at a busy intersection. 3 others, Paul Slow, Evan Liberty, and Dustin Hurled, Dustin Hurd, were sentenced to between 12 to 15 years on manslaughter charges. I don't know if you remember this. These guys get out and start shooting like maniacs. The people recount that their hands were up, running away. Didn't matter. One of the gentlemen they interview gets shot multiple times in the legs and makes the point that his legs don't work right. He can barely stand up. And understand, when you're in a country where your physical labor is your food, is your ability to pay your rent and all of those other things, to be injured in such a way could have debilitating outcomes from the standpoint of your own economic well-being. We, America, as represented by the President of the United States, basically said the murder of these 14 people didn't matter, that all of the people that were shot didn't matter, and that the individual that did those things is basically blameless in the eyes of America. Is that really the perspective of this country that you want to give to the rest of the world? Is that really the perspective you want to give for contractors that are going into other countries? That after something like this, you would think it would put a target on their backs, considering that there's no consequence from the standpoint of the country itself of holding its people accountable. And look, whether you want to think anything about this or not, I would argue that this is infinitely foreseeable. If cops, who have all sorts of laws wrapping their behavior, kill 1,000 people a year with 99% walking without charges, why do you think that there will be a higher level of scrutiny in war zones? They're not. This guy, very few people who get prosecuted for something like this, gets prosecuted, gets in prison, and then at the end of it all, walks. Shane, what do you think about it? Is this the exceptional nation being exceptional once again, where even our murderers are so exceptional they shouldn't spend time in prison? What's going on?
Well, here's the thing. This is sort of how you would expect power to work. So the mercenaries that we hire out to fight our wars, you don't want to punish them too hard, even when they overstep their bounds, even when they're bloody and they kill people. Because if you do that, then you're going to have a hard time hiring other mercenaries. You're going to damage morale, among the sort of contracted class. So you don't do that. You give them pardons occasionally. And then Assange, who's, playing a part in revealing state secrets, you punish him to the utmost extent of the law. In former times, you would have just killed him pretty damn quickly, just either through assassination or hanging, whatnot. You do whatever you can to grind him into the dust. So in that sense, from a world historic vantage, we're actually doing okay. Looking at it relative to what we value, though, we're doing pretty terribly. And I think that this might be sort of one of the weird contradictions that we're living in, is we value certain things in modernity that we see ourselves as a country on the governmental level, matching, living up to, excelling past, like these values of, free speech, open conduct, peaceful affairs, a respect for human nature and the dignity of a human life, all these things. And then we deny those in the interests of this state, in the interest of this higher vehicle, this machine, political machine and a military machine that demands that we ignore those values. And we hide from that fact, because if we were to confront it directly and talk about it like Eisenhower almost did back in the day, like he almost was able to do on a national scale, even though he had perpetrated crimes himself. If we were to confront this stuff, we would be limiting our power, and it is not to our advantage to do so. So I think you get where I'm going with that. I think you get my
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's the shadow self of sorts, and it's the country that doesn't necessarily want to regard itself honestly. I mean, what happens if you have to inspect that? What happens if you have to interrogate the behavior of the military when it commits something wrong? Do you get as many people joining? Do you get as many people joining, let's say, these Blackwater groups or whatever else? I know what they call academia now or something. I mean, no, you're absolutely right. When Saudi Arabia gave like a blanket pardon to pretty much anybody in their military when they're going about doing their crimes, and you have people gasp, and it's like, dude, that's not that far from the way other militaries behave. And so, yeah, Shane, you're right. I agree with you entirely. I mean, it really is this kind of dual step of, meaning people don't do things nakedly, especially if it's bad. And oftentimes there are all sorts of things to try to cover the fact that what they're doing, really, in real terms, is pretty gross, even though they might be cast in these humanitarian terms, humanitarian bombs.
Well, real quick, one last point on this, just looking at Assange. The years of torture and psychological deprivation and the long-term sickness and the rumors of mental illness and all this stuff that's coming out, those are to the security state's advantage. All of the news about Assange, which is pretty much unequivocally bad news when it comes to how he's doing, all of that is great for the national security state in the U.S. and to some extent around the world in the U.K.
Tells you watch your butt, basically.
Because it makes
this is going to happen to you.
Of it. Yeah. Yes, exactly right. Exactly. And so it's horrible. It's horrible to realize that kind of spectacle. That reminds you of something that you might see in like a 13th century kingdom or something like this, and in bygone times, like this public spectacle of torture and humiliation that the enemy of the state is put through. And for the most part, the public doesn't really care or pay attention because they're trained to feel ambiguously about Assange and to see it as almost inevitable how he's being treated. Anyway, we need to go into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break with Dr. Mikhail Kogan. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Medical Director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, Associate Professor of Medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and Executive Director of AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services for the undeserved. Dr. Mikhail Kogan. Dr. Kogan, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Morning. It's early.
Yeah, it is early, and we appreciate you joining us this early. We've been having this conversation about COVID. I mean, we've been covering this from the beginning. I've been even covering it from our own channel. And the numbers and the spikes in these numbers. I mean, we were saying 3,000 people dropped dead, 3,200 people. And at this point, we're almost at 20 million people and almost 4,000 people dead. And now we hear about a new strain of the virus, at the very least that is in the UK. And it is very possible, however, that strain is in the United States, considering the US doesn't really do a lot of testing to try to determine variances within the context of the virus, and the UK does. What do we know about this new strain of the virus? Is it more, let's say, virulent? Does it have, meaning in all of the mutations? I think there was 23 new mutations. Why is that weird for a virus to have that many mutations? I guess what I'm asking is, give us the science and the updates on this particular virus, what we know so far, and what are some of the alarming traits of the new variant?
Right. Well, I think we knew that this virus mutates at the high speed. I think we even before, maybe a couple of months ago, talked about the fact that this could happen, that the virus will mutate into more virulent or more deadly strains. So this seems to happen. So this specific new strain that's coming from England, or thought to be originating from England, seems to be 70% more contagious or more infectious, meaning that it infects more people and seems to infect them somewhat faster. Now, the exact sequence of the new strain has been also done, and it looks like there's very specific mutations that can be tracked. And because this strain is more infectious, it's and spread faster. It looks like, at least in England right now, it spreads a lot faster than the older strains. So the new infections are now becoming, especially in London, predominantly of this new strain. I think you're also absolutely correct. Chances are that, unfortunately, the new strain is already here. And, I think the part of the reason for that is the control. We knew about this virus, this new strain, for quite a while. So this is not the fact that it's spreading faster and the fact that it's sort of took over, at least in London, the majority of new cases, that's new. But it's been first identified earlier in the fall. So it took that long for it to sort of expand and spread. So it's probably already here, simply statistically speaking, because it's been enough time for it to travel from there to here. And since we have really in the quarantine from Europe, that's the case. Now, how long it will take for it to spread here, I think it's anybody's guess, but my assumption that it will know about this pretty soon. If it's that contagious, it spreads here. Now, hopefully that won't even happen if the vaccine is going to kick in, and maybe we are sort of talking about this as a new point, since hopefully the spread will not occur that fast enough for the vaccine, and vaccine will catch it.
Dr. Kogan, thank you for joining us. I want to turn to another side of COVID, talking about the vaccine here. Obviously, this has been big news over the past couple of weeks. What appears to be the beginnings of a successful rollout in the United States. I'm curious, we can talk about the specifics here, what differentiates these mRNA vaccines from other types of vaccines, all that stuff. But just in a broad sense, I want to start with, what do you think about the rollout in terms of how quickly or slowly it's been done, in terms of the numbers of doses that have been sent out to different states in the U.S., just in a broad sense, looking at this sort of as a medical professional? What do you think about it? What would you do differently? What's your take, Dr. Kogan?
Well, I don't know if I'm the best person to ask this question, but from what I'm seeing, and especially now considering the fact that both of these vaccines have to be frozen, one at a very low temperature with the very special freezers and the other ones with the regular freezers. If you consider that, I think the rollout has been pretty efficient. Just at the looking at, even forget about what we know from media outlets. I'm just looking at my colleagues at other institutions across the country, and I'm seeing, a lot of healthcare workers getting vaccinated. I'm scheduled to get vaccinated on Monday, this upcoming Monday. So it seems to me at least quite efficient. Now, I don't know if I'm 100% agree with sort of idea that only a first line and nursing home residents should get it as a first line, but that gets into a quite complicated conversation about who should be prioritized and how. I think the reality is you can't really spend a lot of time figuring this out. You have to just keep redistributing the vaccines. Plus, of course, you guys, I don't know if you already talked about it, but Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine is coming up early in January and probably going to get approved pretty quickly. So that vaccine only requires one shot, and my understanding that it's stored at the regular temperature. So that also going to kind of add to the hopefully speed of delivery of the shots.
Dr. Kogan, could you fix your mic for me for a moment? It sounds like there's a bit of crackling and your voice is kind of wavering a bit.
How about that? How about this?
Okay, we can try it. We can see if it sounds a little bit better. It's funny. That is somewhat of an interesting conversation in regards to who should get it first. Now, the vaccine itself, though, I didn't think the vaccine had been tested for people with like comorbidities and those type of things. It was specifically for people who basically were healthy or maybe older. Am I wrong on that? Like, or did they get the opportunity to test it on these various adverse cases?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of different. Both trials are really big. I mean, tens of thousands of people. So, in both cases, there were patients with comorbidities and older adults. So, I think that's not necessarily the main concern. I think there is some concern as to whether certain groups of people included people who have a really significant immune compromise or people who have very significant autoimmune conditions or allergic reactions. But, if you think about this, that the attempt was indeed to capture pretty much very wide, broad of possible patients. I think that's from the way I see it, it was done quite well. And, the other thing is we do know that certain categories of people have been excluded. So pregnant women, breastfeeding women, and kids under 16. So those, unfortunately, are not approved to get the vaccine. So they will be left out, at least until we have either a new vaccine coming that was tested on this group, or there's going to be another study and an approval by the FDA for the new indications. But for now, that's what we have.
So another side of this is that if I look at Russia and China, they both got vaccines out substantially earlier, and we're using them, giving them to a substantial chunk of the general public months ago. And, you compare that, the EU is slower than the US, and the US is slower than Russia and China. It seems like, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, it seems like we had the functional part of the genome of this virus constructed, modeled back in January, where it took just a couple of days and researchers had built this thing and we're effectively ready not to roll the vaccine out because you still need to do trials, but to start producing it in small batches for the sake of doing trials. And if we had done that earlier on, we could have had an earlier release and potentially that could have saved a lot of lives. Now, that's a kind of a controversial take for a lot of people because a lot of people looking at this are like, hey, this vaccine is completely untested. Almost completely untested. Like we were just talking about, folks with comorbidities weren't part of the trialing process because, they're more likely to get sick and people with comorbidities who are also elderly who would be dying from this disease at the greatest rates also weren't trialed. And therefore, we're sort of leaving ourselves in the dark. There are different ways you can look at this. I'm just curious from your perspective, how do you look at this? Should we have started this earlier? Are we still too early to be rolling this out, to be administering this to the public? What's your take?
Yeah. I think the question is sort of timing here is a difficult question because making the vaccine genome is great to have, but the making of a vaccine is a very difficult, long process. The fact that this vaccines came out this fast, quite shocking. Usually, at least in the past, for any new disease, I don't know what you remember with Ebola, it took much, much longer, and it was also an mRNA vaccine. So, I think this, from scientific perspective, it's shocking that the vaccine was sort of manufactured so quickly. Now, after that, in terms of making the available doses, I think it's a whole separate conversation. I'm not exactly sure that I know all the details to sort of comment how fast it's being offered to everybody. But I actually think that that was faster. Now, why China and Russia managed to get it faster, I think that's an interesting conversation in itself. But those vaccines are indeed different. The one in the Sputnik one in Russia, that's also a DNA vaccine. So this is the similar vaccine that Johnson & Johnson coming out. Why they managed to get it early so quickly, I don't know. I actually don't know the exact answer to that. You would think that it would depend primarily on getting the hold of the virus very early, not just the sequence, and having a very strong team of immunologists or scientists who actually make the vaccines to produce it. I don't know. Did you guys bring anybody on the show to try to answer this? It's a good question.
We'd love to. No, we haven't yet. No, it's been a little bit hard finding people on this, but it was back in, I believe, August for both Russia and China that they started to roll these vaccines out. So that's 4 months ago at this point, pending the exact date. That's just a huge head start.
Right. Well, another part is I wonder if they simply sort of cut short some of the trial methodology. The trials that I've seen, it takes a time to set up a good trial. It's not just like, making a vaccine takes time. It's not an overnight process. You have to take into account a lot of different factors. You have to figure out how you're going to appropriately create placebo. How are you going to get the study approved from ethics perspective, something called Institutional Review Board, or IRB. So I think there may have been some steps that were done differently, or maybe they got some kind of easement on some of the processes that are routinely required in science. I don't know. But I don't know if the actual creation of the first batch of the vaccine time-wise was quite dramatically different. I think when the first patient in a trial got the vaccine, and also when as the first regular public person got the vaccine outside of the trial. So those are the, they seem to be different, right? But are they different because there was some way that the trials were set up different, and then the results were obtained of the trials a lot faster, and thus they were approved by the government faster? And was that approval based on appropriate data? That's a separate conversation. It
is, and what we got to go into a break. What complicates things here even further, and I want to let you respond when we come back, is just it's a pandemic. This is a sort of unprecedented emergency that we're dealing with in the modern era. Whatever exactly that means, whatever range you're going to put on that. But it's been approximately a century, as far as I can tell, at least by a lot of folks' accounts, that the world has had to face this kind of fast-spreading, disease. I was going to say a fatal disease, but it's not as fatal as we were originally thinking. It's not multiple percentage points of the population who gets it that's dying, thankfully. Anyway, and so in that sort of emergency climate, it might necessitate speeding things up, but then of course you don't want to do more damage than you intended by rolling something out that's dangerous. In any event, we need to go into a break. We were joined by Dr. Mikhail Kogan, medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. You're also listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Dr. Mikhail Kogan, medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and founder and executive director at the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the undeserved. Again, Dr. Mikhail Kogan, welcome back to the show, man.
Have to be here.
I want to get into a compare and contrast with something like the Spanish flu. Now, I know this is not entirely the same, meaning I know that the Spanish flu was far more infectious. And I also know that during the time that it was being passed, a lot of it was because of the war. Basically, all of the troops and everything was going back home. You had a ripe environment to spread this stuff all over the world. And 100 million people, if not more, had died from it. It was extraordinarily infectious. I'm curious, if something like that hit instead of COVID, based on our response to COVID, what would, it almost feels like even with 400,000 people dead, we dodged a bullet. Am I entirely overly cynical on that?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I hate to say this, but we probably got lucky that this virus is not as contagious as it could have been. And it's not like we didn't. There's smart people who were talking about this for years, right? In fact, there were even attempts at trying to prevent this from happening from all over the world. Different programs were set up, and it doesn't look like we're doing enough to prevent this. Look, we're in the total globalization as is, right? I mean, trying to think that we can isolate any component of our world at this point doesn't seem to be reasonable at all. It spreads everywhere quickly because of just the way we live now. And, thank God we have better medical care and vaccines. But look, I mean, what if this virus would have been 10 times more virulent and spreading faster? Then it could have been total catastrophe, right? So I think it hopefully will be a wake-up call, not just for all of us, but specifically for politicians to say, look, this has to be planned for the future, and we have to have enough resources and more importantly, infrastructure to deal if something like this ever happens again. Which I think that it's not even ever; it's when. So and the other significant point I want to make, we do live in a very unprecedented times of continuous change of our immune system. We're throwing it at all kinds of medications and antibiotics, and our lives are now quite different how they were 100 years ago. Our microbiome, our gut microbes, normal microbes are changing because of the way we live our lives, and that triggers certain immune changes. I think if we don't carefully track all of this and be sure that we continuously preparing our system for next similar event, we're getting weaker, probably not stronger, and it's next generations will have to deal with the reality that this will keep happening. Now, the question is this going to keep happening at what frequency? And do we have enough time to predict which outbreak's going to occur again and when? I don't know. So those are all questions. But you're absolutely right. It's unfortunately, the reality of our lives, and all we can do is try to prepare for it.
I'm curious, are you familiar? So much talked about back in October of last year, there was Event 201, which was a pandemic preparation exercise for a coronavirus emerging from Asia. Some of the details were different. So, for instance, in the event, they're talking about how it originated in pigs, yes, in wild livestock sales, which was during the early days of the pandemic with the open market in Wuhan. That was a sort of similar path of association, but it was a different animal. Mm-hmm. Pigs are not supposed to be the origin of this one. And then in the event, they also talked about how it came from Brazil, or it spread most quickly in Brazil in the early stages. So there are a couple of differences there, but they got the coronavirus aspect of it right. And of course, after SARS, that would make sense. Here's where I'm going with this one. Other than coronaviruses, what other families of viruses are you familiar with that would potentially cause another pandemic? Is there any category of illnesses that we should be worried about getting exacerbated by some mutation in the future? Or is that, what's your take on that?
I don't know. I mean, that's not something I follow. My take on this is sort of out of our control area, meaning, we can try to study this and follow the possible research on this, but in reality, I don't know how much we can prepare ourselves outside of what I just explained. The trying to prepare immune system is probably the most important thing we can do. I mean, whether or not you can organize your life logistics to be better prepared, that's also an interesting question that, I'm sure a lot of people think through. After all of those, preppers, I think as they're called, were not all that off, right? And some degree of preparation, I think, is and was and is quite important part of thinking about this forward. But I personally don't know. I didn't actually specifically look into sort of where is this going to come and how. I mean, it's good enough for me to know that it's coming and that I hear the information coming from relatively trusted sources and from many different sources. And if every head of a nation, look, we have to prepare for it. And their call for actions were, as you said, there were even scenarios of trying to think through this and literally organize how we're going to respond and train it doesn't seem like, unfortunately, it did much. Or maybe it did. And, we're just blaming everybody of what happened, but maybe it could have been a lot worse.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. Even though it's true. I mean, it is true. I mean, like the thing postulated before with the Spanish flu. If that was this, and you had all of those people dropping dead, and you have like the president saying, "Hey, it'll be okay, it'll be okay, it'll be okay," like it's just I quiver at thinking how bad this could have been, in spite of how bad it actually was. And one other thing, social distancing. We have nearly 400,000 people dead at this point. It doesn't seem like the techniques that we're using are working, and I don't think people could conceivably social distance for a year. Like, I am one of the proponents on the show who've been very strident and fighting hard against all comers on this notion of masks, on this notion of lockdowns, giving people money to keep them out of the streets and everything else. That's me. I'm that guy. I'm the guy on the wall. But I am curious about, is there anything else? Because it doesn't seem to be working. And you can make an argument that, well, wait, people aren't really shutting down in the way that they should, or they aren't wearing masks in the way that they should. But the majority of the population, I think, at this point, gets it, even if there's a small section that doesn't. It doesn't seem to be working.
I think it's a question. Well, I think it's a question, what is that smaller size of population actually is? And if it's one person out of the 100, probably won't make a difference. But it's 20 or 30, you're basically dramatically reducing what the other 60, 70, or 80 people are doing in terms of the risk of exposure for everybody. So I don't know if we even clear why, for example, in California, despite a pretty strict lockdown, they have a pretty massive spikes. Most people that I'm hearing saying, look, this are the measures we know. This are the measures that we should be using. We know that they're working. I mean, of course, they're not working 100%, obviously. But, it's better than if we wouldn't have had any precautions at all, just sitting there kind of doing whatever we want, waiting for the vaccine to come. I think the bigger question is, why do we still we do not have enough data on some of these tools to be very carefully tested. We have some, but I wish we'd have a lot more so that we can actually convince the public and show them what works and what doesn't. I mean, masks do work. I mean, but look at what's going on sort of a general social media, right? For every post that mask work, there's another post that says mask doesn't work. And then the viewer is sort of completely overwhelmed and can't really make a decision because both sides seem to be showing some kind of data to support their statement. I'll tell you, my simple experience is very simple. So GW Hospital has been serving patients with COVID from the start. Not a single staff member who were exposed to these patients knowingly wearing full PPE got sick. So, and that's been 6 months. So that tells you that the significant measures, when you carefully think through them, when you apply them as they recommended, they work, and they work pretty effectively. I mean, nothing is 100% proof, but it's not that far off. So, and, with that, the key question is this transmission simply occurs from the people when nobody is aware that a person transmitting? And my guess is the answer is yes. So it's a combination of not universal use of protective equipment and distancing, combined with the fact that some transmissions occur when you really can't pre-plan it. You can try, but you just can't.
You can't catch it all. That's what it basically was. I think the study in Germany had between 45% to 75% effectiveness from the standpoint of masks. And that depends on, where you are, how often the person touches their face, and those other conditions. But it was very clear that they did work. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, thank you, man. I appreciate you coming on. Dr. Mikhail Kogan is medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the undeserved. You can learn more about the AIM Health Institute by visiting www.healthaim.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines in the news. Let's get to the headlines. In the news. Updated yesterday at 12:30 p.m., the CDC COVID tracker reported 18,170,062 total COVID cases and 321,734 total deaths, including 3,165 new deaths. That number is so disturbing to me. California has become the first state to hit 2 million COVID cases. This came just 6 weeks after hitting the 1 million mark. More than 23,500 Californians have died from the virus since the pandemic began. Because of the COVID lockdown, states around the United States are facing steep deficits and little federal aid in sight. The shift to remote work could give many cash-strapped states a legitimate way to bring back much-needed tax revenue. So, a group of states joined a U.S. Supreme Court battle that could determine whether jurisdictions can tax the income of remote workers who are no longer commuting to the office. New Jersey, along with Connecticut, Hawaii, and Iowa, submitted an amicus brief on Tuesday in a lawsuit that challenges the authority of states to tax non-residents' income while they've been working from home. At the center of the controversy is a court case between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The Bay State has been taxing New Hampshire residents who have been working remotely since the pandemic, spurring the Granite State to file suit against Massachusetts. In October, New Jersey's brief supports New Hampshire's position. The brief also pushes back on New York, which taxes Garden State residents who normally commute there, though many now are working from home. That is so weird, and I gotta be honest, I hate that so much. Maybe Shane, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but it sounds like these states just want to get money out of people, and they're coming to the conclusion that, hey, these people used to travel here, but now that they're not traveling here, we're not getting the money from them, so we need to come up with some other excuse and advice or device to get revenue out of those people, despite the fact they don't live in our state. How bizarre!
I think it's the other way
that?
around. I think they're taxing them even though they're not residents, but because they're working there, because they're stationed there, they're living there temporarily while the pandemic's ongoing, they're taxing them. In which case, you can make an argument for it, but I don't like it. I don't like it either.
It's just a little.
Don't just sound like a libertarian there, Jamarl.
Well,
You're
it's just
arguing
a little
for less
weird to me.
tax.
I mean,
come on.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding this. So basically, they are working from home in another state. And so the state where they're working in is trying to tax them. Is that what it is? Because I thought it sounded like, when I read it, that it was basically people who were commuting. And because they weren't commuting anymore, that somehow the other state was trying to get money out of them. But maybe I misunderstood this. Explain this for me.
No, the working from home is one part of it, but I think a bunch of people have also moved casually, where their residency is still in one state, they're still domiciled in that state, but they've moved and they're either staying with family or friends or whatever the case might be. And then there are people who are working from home, and then you combine the two and it gets complicated. But broadly, I think it works in both directions. Now, some of those people would be using the other state's infrastructure. So say, for instance, your residency is in Utah, but you're working in Idaho, and you're living in Idaho, even though your residency is in Utah. Well, you'd be using Idaho's roads, you'd be using their services, but that's not your state of residence.
Yeah, that just goes a little weird.
It does. I hear you.
Yeah, that's just a little weird to me. I don't want to be taxed in a state that I don't live. You know what I mean? Like, in what are they going to double up on the taxes? So you have to pay in your state and the other state. Like, it just seems like these guys are trying to get money. When, I don't know if you remember this, when several people have been killed, several blacks have been killed by cops. And the Obama administration put through, basically sent, I think, Eric Holder to do this kind of write-up on, I think it was Baltimore and I think it was Ohio. And both basically came out with the same assessment, that cops in those areas basically criminalize the poor, using fines and all of these other things to basically keep their little cities up and running as opposed to taxing the wealth of their city. This puts me in a similar mindset where it seems like the state is trying to basically pilfer money off of the residents. I could be wrong, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what I'm reading, but it just seems, and I'm not a big fan of that one. I need to go into that a little bit more in depth.
Okay, so looking into it the tiniest little bit, some states will tax, these 7 states will tax employees' income based on the state that the employer is based in. And that would include New York. So if you live in New Jersey and you work for a company that's based in New York, while you're working at home or wherever you're living, whatever the case may be, you are being taxed by New York because that's where your employer is based. And other states have raised this, and it's a Supreme Court battle now. So they've raised it as a legal issue, and that's the controversy.
That is an interesting thing, though. So if let's say I'm in Maryland, I work in DC, and it's like, okay, so is DC going to tax based on my work because it's in DC? And so, okay, I guess that makes sense. I guess they're trying to argue, well, look, these people aren't commuting anymore, and because they're not commuting anymore, should we not be paying in the taxes on that? That's such a weird case. Yeah, we have to look more into that. That's very strange to me, or very odd. But let's get back to the headlines, and we can go back to it. Yesterday, Trump pardoned 26 more people and commuted sentences of 3 more people. The list includes former campaign chair Paul Manafort, convicted of financial fraud and conspiring to obstruct the investigation of his crimes. Longtime friend Roger Stone was upgraded from clemency to full pardon, convicted during the Mueller investigation. Charles Kushner, father of Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who pleaded guilty to making false statements to the Federal Election Commission, witness tampering and tax evasion. James Kassoff, guilty of filing a false tax return in 1989. Mary McCarthy, a former Florida County Commissioner, guilty of honest services fraud in 2009. Christopher Wade, convicted of cybercrimes. Christopher Anthony Bryant, a community leader in Kentucky, guilty of federal cocaine offenses. Cesar Lozanda, an immigrant from Cuba, guilty of conspiring to distribute marijuana. Joseph Martin Stevens, guilty of being a felon in possession of a firearm. Andrew Byrne Warden, an entrepreneur convicted of wire fraud. Roger Coughlin, guilty of conflict of interest in performing his duties as a Department of Justice official. John Boltby and Peter Atkinson, both convicted of mail fraud. Joseph Akpatintini, I went for it, former supervisor or supervisory special agent with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights under the color of law and making false statements, and quite a few more. No Julian Assange, and no Edward Snowden. Speaking of which, calls for Julian Assange to be pardoned by the United States President Donald Trump are on the rise, with activists, journalists, writers, campaigners, and politicians from across the ideological spectrum demanding that WikiLeaks publisher be freed during the final days of the current administration. German legislatures have formed the, quote, Free Julian Assange, unquote, working group, and amid growing calls for the WikiLeaks publisher to be pardoned by the United States President Donald Trump. Christian Meir of Reporters Without Borders, which has been monitoring Assange's extradition hearings, announced the formation of the cross-party group in Bundestag on the 21st of December 2020. The letter says that the working group was founded, quote, out of the great concern for the life of journalist and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who has been in solitary confinement and in critical condition for over 18 months at the high-security Belmarsh prison in the UK, and whose extradition to the United States is to be decided upon on January 4th, 2021. Assange's mother, who recently announced that she would stop using social media for her own good, nonetheless took to Twitter to thank MPs and others for all of their hard work on the issue. The announcement from Germany comes at the same time that the group of Australian MPs and senators signed an open letter to President Trump calling on him to either pardon Assange or drop the prosecution case against him. Quote, Assange has fought for truth and justice. His work with WikiLeaks has pioneered accountability in the media and exposed corruption, civil liberties violations in the United States and around the world, and the true cost of war, the politicians write. Boris Johnson is to address his nation on Thursday morning as the UK and the EU are set to be close to clinching a Brexit deal. The agreement will let the UK trade freely with the EU without tariffs or quotas. Chief spokesman of the European Commission, Eric Mamer, said earlier that the European Union and the United Kingdom will continue to work on the post-Brexit trade agreement throughout the night, as media reports suggested that the deal could be reached in the early hours of Thursday. London has made significant concessions in the talks, including on the stumbling fisheries issue within the past 24 hours. Earlier, the EU Council had begun the procedure of preparing for the implementation of a potential trade agreement with the UK, which should come into force on the 1st of January, but only if the European Parliament and the British Parliament have time to ratify it between Christmas and New Year. If London and Brussels find no common ground by December 31st, the UK will no longer be under the European Union's trade rules, and the World Trade Organization rules will come into force for both sides in 2021, including custom tariffs and full border checks for goods flowing across the English Channel, basically a no-deal Brexit. Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney said there has been, quote, some sort of last-minute hitch, unquote, over the small print of the fishing quotas agreement, but a deal was still expected later. You know, to point out, interestingly enough, there's these fudges in British law that are always fascinating to me, and even in trade negotiations. The fudge is typically put in there because they can't come to somewhat of an agreement in immediate, but they don't necessarily want to let it crash the deal. And they believe that it's things that they can be worked out later in court, fighting it out, etc., but they believe that the deal is more important. So sometimes they will put fudges into these things that don't necessarily have a clear resolution for that very specific reason that there is no clear resolution. Let's go to the next one. An anti-monopoly investigation has been initiated against Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba Group, the State Administration for Market Regulation said on Thursday. Quote, the State Administration for Market Regulation, in accordance with the received complaint, has initiated an investigation against Alibaba Company on suspicion of a monopoly, unquote, the authorities said. Ma's offer did not help salvage the IPO since Beijing was angered by its criticism of the government's excessive regulation in the national financial industry, which he viewed as a major obstacle for the growth of the new financial services and innovations. Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly personally ordered Chinese regulators to study possible risk posed by Ant Group and suspended the IPO's co-founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, Co-founder of Alibaba's group, Jack Ma, offered to hand over parts of his financial technology giant Ant Group to the Chinese government in an attempt to save the company's initial public offering. That was suspended by the Shanghai Stock Exchange on the 3rd of November. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Shane, I want to talk about this last one for a moment. That is fascinating to me. Now, the thing with China that has always been interesting, and even in some of the conversations we've had with people that come on the show that have a lot of knowledge about it, is this notion of the capitalist class within a communist country, whereas the United States seems to be the inverted version of that. And my thought is always, if these guys are getting as much money, if you do have this wealth distribution or this wealth distinction, meaning the moment that they allowed their economic sector to balloon, well, they also had this thing where there were certain people at the top, they were getting greatly rich. So you had these variances in income, even in the communist country. My thought was always, would those variances in income eventually translate to actual power and influence? Meaning another power center in China that is fighting for control of the device of the country itself. In the country, we have capitalists. That's the prevailing ideology of this country. That's the only ideology of this country. And so there's not that pull and push. You might say Sanders and people on the left, but that's not really the same. It doesn't get to a point where the moneyed class in China start to try to pull control because they've been allowed to flourish from the standpoint of the money that they can generate. Or is the communist government fully in control and have mechanisms in place to keep that, let's say, dog on a leash? It's fascinating stuff in regards to that country, and I love having people on to talk about it. Let's do this. Let's take a break because we're hitting a hard break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Bosworth. We are joined for the first time in a long time by Dr. Annette Bosworth. She is an internal medicine physician and former South Dakota senatorial candidate. And by the way, you can and you should follow Annette on Twitter at Annette Bosworth. Buy Annette's book any way you can on Amazon. Watch her videos on YouTube at youtube.com/Annette Bosworth MD and learn more about her work at bosmd.com. And that is Boz with a Z, by the way. Annette, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Good morning, Shane. I'm doing great. It's great to be back on the show.
Great to have you back. All right, let's get into it. It's been a long time since we've talked about the keto diet. This used to be one of the mainstays of conversation back when Lee, my dad, and Garland Nixon were co-hosting the show. But it's been a long time since we've had you on and a long time since we've had that conversation. So I think since it's been so long and since we have a new audience in part with some of Jamarl's followers and fans joining us on the show, I thought it would make sense to do a refresher, a bit of a primer for folks who are new to the show. Could you just give us an intro? What is the ketogenic diet? What is the keto diet? How does it work? And why should we be interested in potentially subscribing to it?
Well, the ketogenic diet, I teach patients is it's not about the food, it's about the chemistry flowing through your body. To get that chemistry to show up, it is a high-fat diet with a moderate amount of protein and very low carbohydrate diet. That process of setting up the chemistry on the inside for most people, I push patients to keep their total carbohydrate count below 20, and that gets me a pretty high confidence that they're in the ketogenic state. But I don't usually let them by just saying that. I have them check ketones with either a urine ketone strip or a blood test with the prick of their finger to say lowering the amount of carbohydrates and eating that really you'll have ketones as the way you fuel your body as opposed to a glucose molecule. And that diet has kind of swept the country. It's swept the globe in many cases. Over the last probably 5 years, I think has been a pretty hot topic in my clinic and in many clinics throughout the globe as a way to reduce inflammation. The purpose of the diet is people do lose weight, but it's the anti-inflammatory effect from the chemistry state of being in ketosis that really helps the body.
Now, what does it mechanically mean to be in ketosis? Like when you're making the point of it is in the best interest of the body, or at the very least cuts down inflammation. What does it mean specifically for the body to go into ketosis?
Yeah, so when I say, are you in ketosis, I ask patients, have you been in ketosis? It's not an opinion. They can actually check it. So the first thing that can be, they can confirm is they are being in ketosis means their body will use ketones for fuel, and that ketone is the molecule. There's 3 types of ketones, but there's one that you can prick with the tip of your finger and check in a meter. There's also another one that flows into your urine. And being in ketosis means that you burn that for fuel instead of burning glucose. And that glucose is always going to be burned within a human body. You'll never have a zero glucose, but lowering the glucose enough that the body reaches for the other resource, which is a ketone made from fat, is helpful for improving the baseline of energy in their body, but also it's a lower state of inflammation when their system uses ketones for fuel instead of just straight glucose.
And you just mean carbs. Just so we're specific, like basically the body burns carbs when the carbs are available. When the carbs are no longer available, it goes to fat. And you're saying that the burning of the fat produces ketones, and the ketones is an indication that your body is basically in that state.
Correct. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
Glucose is easy. You don't have to practice using glucose for fuel. That's the default. When it's there, it will be burned. Ketone is a more it is a preferred fuel by our cells, but we will not make a ketone when there's excess glucose around. Most of our diet is so heavy in carbohydrates that the system just won't make a ketone until they restrict the amount of glucose going in. And in my recommendation, I push patients to keep those carbohydrates less than 20, and that's a total carbohydrates in a day. And those
are grams, right? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, 20 grams, right? An apple has 18 carbs in it. So when people start counting carbs, just by point of, looking into your mornings, what did each of you have for breakfast this morning?
I didn't eat breakfast.
I've
typically
I've
one
not
meal
had
a day
breakfast
in the evenings.
Drinking coffee with cream so far, and usually like Jamarl, I'm like one maybe two meals a day, something like that.
Yeah, that's a typical approach to what most of my patients end up on. When they're on a non-ketogenic diet, when they're on their normal diet outside of or prior to starting, most Americans eat at least 3 meals a day, but more often they snack several times throughout the day. So you can see the calorie consumption is every 2 to 3, maybe if they're lucky, every 4 hours. And the danger of that is that they're constantly putting energy into the body with that eating cycle, and their ability to transition the chemistry away from a glucose dominant diet to a ketone loaded diet. It's almost impossible when they eat that many times throughout the day. More often when we start having them eat, when they first go on the diet, I tell them, I don't care, you can eat as many times a day as you want to, just you got to keep those carbs less than 20. And even though they are still eating quite a bit of calories, and we've got lots of problems we're going to have to deal with in these patients, that when they start eating mostly fat, it's about 3 days later that their body doesn't want to eat as often. By about 7 to 10 days later, they're really at an 8-hour cycle of wanting food. They don't need to put calories in as often. The amount of hunger is less, and the ketone production is higher. So, yeah. So how long have you eaten 2 meals a day?
For me, it's been months at this point. I used to be on pretty close to a carnivore diet where I was eating a bunch of meat, and then some butter and some dairy products. And more recently, I've added some veggies back in, and usually now it's like some salmon with some broccoli and cauliflower, and yes, carrots. I throw carrots in there. I know those have carbs in them. And then other times it's ground beef or steak, that kind of thing. But usually one, sometimes 2 meals a day. How about you, Jamarl?
I do 1 meal a day. I mean, and I've been doing that for God knows how long. I mean, when I was younger, I weighed, I think, up to 260 pounds when I was in high school. And I lost about 100 pounds that first, I thought, like one of the years. So like by the time I got to my junior year, I had lost like 100 pounds. And so it's like trying to keep the weight off and maintain the weight off and that type of stuff. It just became easier for 1 meal a day. I may have like a sandwich or something that's low in calories or low in fat over the course of the day. But typically it's like that evening meal where I could just go bananas and, just pass out. It's at that point you're hungry, you're good, you're wanting to eat. And when you finally eat, it's late. So if you nod off, it's not necessarily the worst. I've been doing that for years.
Yeah. So how old are you now, Jamal?
I am 43.
Yeah. So looking at the transition of metabolism as patients age, when they find a rhythm that keeps the weight pretty stable, has your weight been pretty stable with 1 meal a day?
More or less, yeah. Usually at 1 meal a day, I can keep it balanced. When I need to pull down in a weight, because sometimes it fluctuates within like 5 pounds. Because, like everybody else, there are times where you eat more or less. Like Thanksgiving was, oh my God. And so there are those moments. But for the most part, it stays relatively stable within 5 pounds.
And do you eat a ketogenic way?
No, I don't. My wife does. Well, my wife used to. My wife did keto for like 2 years. But no, I've never done the keto diet. I mean, for the most part, I've always just kind of, I would manage. To me, it was more so, as long as I keep it to 1 meal a day, I'm not going to go overboard in regards to calories, fat, et cetera, et cetera. That was always the way I thought about it. It was like a lazy man's way of trying to keep my weight down. That's honestly where it came from.
Yeah, well, it actually would be considered a time-restricted eating where they limit their calorie intake to, a 2-hour window or a 1-hour window. And as you look at that approach, I would be curious if you have ketones in circulation right before that meal, and I'll practically guarantee it that you had that in your 20s and 30s. But as patients age into their 40s, their efficiency to burn an excess amount of glucose is their insulin is more resistant. Their insulin their body isn't as responsive to insulin. It takes more insulin to get the job done. And I've had several people with this approach with 1 meal a day that you're on. And as they hit into their 40s, their weight continues to be, the problem returns. But even if they say, I want to continue this 1 meal a day, is there anything else that can be done to improve your insulin response, which is, again, the core science behind what's happening on a ketogenic diet? And I tell them, yeah, you should not eat any calories when it's dark. Push the intake of that 1 meal a day closer to noon. And obviously, if you've been eating in the evening hours for a couple of decades and somebody pushes it to noon, suddenly they're probably not going to stick to it. But if you inch it back to saying, okay, I'm going to eat at 4 o'clock, nothing after, no calories in the house or in the evenings, last snitch of food goes in, by 4:30, if you would. And then watch what happens with that. That pattern of eating when you eat right up till bedtime, especially if it's got a hearty dose of carbohydrates in it, and then you ask your system to metabolize it while sleeping, it's you'll see an increased deterioration of their brain. I call it a mini concussion from the kind of the gluttony of food. Will add a slight swelling to their brain. They'll say, Doc, I can't fall asleep without eating right before bed. And what's happening is they're using that insulin resistance and the consumption of carbs to swell their brain every night. And that's how they're inducing sleep.
Oh, that is not sexy at all. That's not. Yeah, that's not fun. You're referring to the glycemic index. That's basically what it sounds like. Basically, your body's reaction to carbohydrates and the deleterious effect that reaction has, which means less carbs, less index. Let's do this. Shane is probably going to bring you back, but I do want to get into an explanation of what that means.
Here's the thing. We have another guest next.
Oh,
segment.
I'm sorry. I always get caught with that. I'm sorry. Okay.
It's cool. Tyler Nixon for the next two segments. But Annette, if you're down, we should bring you back on soon to continue this conversation. Get into insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, how those relate to inflammation, and just in general, keep the conversation going.
Sure, that'd be great. Jamal, I'll love to hear next week how it goes to move that meal closer to sunrise.
I hear you. This brain swelling doesn't sound great.
It does not. I know that does not sound pleasing. Annette, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Annette, for those listening, Annette Bosworth is an internal medicine physician and former South Dakota senatorial candidate. She's a doctor. You can follow Annette on Twitter at Annette Bosworth. Buy Annette's book any way you can on Amazon. Watch her videos on YouTube at youtube.com/Annette Bosworth MD and learn more about her work at bosmd.com. And that is Boz with a Z. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Nixon, not Garland Nixon. This time we've got Tyler P. Nixon on, archivist, activist, technologist, and legal counsel to Roger Stone. This is particularly salient after Trump gave a full pardon, not just clemency, but a full pardon to Roger Stone yesterday. By the way, before we get into the conversation with Tyler, you can and you should follow Tyler on Twitter at @RealTylerNixon. Mr. Nixon, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Oh, great. It's good to be with you guys.
Good to have you back. All right. We'll just start off right here. What do you think of this full pardon? This is a long time coming. What's your take on this?
I think it is justice that has finally been done in Roger Stone's case. I was with him yesterday, and it's something that's, well, I mean, after going through 2 years of a malicious persecution by cronies of the committed enemies, and I mean enemies, not just adversaries of President Trump. It's almost like a I don't know how to describe it. It's not sort of it's like you've been through so much that you're sort of almost numb to it. But obviously, Roger's family is thrilled. I mean, this was sort of just to avoid. This was really more so that the jackals, frankly, Andrew Weissman, all these Neil Katyal, who are vindictive enough to want to continue pursuing their Russian collusion hoax and continue persecuting the president's allies are not able to continue doing so into the future. So, Roger had obviously been relieved of the punishment aspect of the sentence imposed on him by the very, very partisan judge in the district court in Washington, who oversaw his show trial, which is all I can say it is, having seen it on the inside. And I just think that this weaponization of our justice system as a political tool is one of the most serious and grave developments in our republic in a long time. Perhaps that was the case maybe back in the 19th century, that there were instances of it, but it's really become systematic at this point, and it's very disturbing. But I think President Trump did the right thing. I wish now that he would pardon Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Ross Ulbricht, and there's a particular case that I would, it's obscure and really no one knows about. It's a former Secret Service agent, in fact, the first black Secret Service agent, and his name is Abraham W. Bolden. I wish the president would also issue a pardon for him, but we can discuss that more. But, there's elation for sure. But like I said, it's kind of, it's not so much an afterthought. It's obviously looking to the future. But after going through what Roger has been, short of his serving prison, I mean, they've just destroyed his life. So it's time for him to rebuild now.
Tyler, it's funny, as I sit here and listen to you, there are parts I agree with greatly and there are parts I don't agree with. And I think ultimately I agree with you, despite I think we may have some differences in the way we see it. From my standpoint, selective justice is not justice. Meaning, I have great qualms and issues with using the political device, or let's say the governmental device, to settle political vendettas and scores. And that's what it seemed like happened with Stone. I mean, look, personally, Stone did lie in that case. But whether he was guilty or not is almost secondary to the fact that the other people have lied to Congress without consequence and for greater reasons. Not to mention that gimmick of an event, of a stunt, when they had the news cameras as they descended on his house like he was going to come out with guns blazing. Like, all of those things bespeak of it not being, okay, we're just following the law and doing the prosecution. It looked as if it was, we're going to punish. We're going to make this bad. We're going to make this hurt. And that went far beyond the notion of just the typical thing of, okay, we're just here doing our jobs. I mean, what do you think about the whole selective justice element of this? I mean, Brennan lied to Congress about spying on Congress about the torture stuff. You had Clapper lied outright about whether or not the United States was spying. Neither one of them was prosecuted. Neither one of them was even given a thought of prosecution. And yet, I would argue that those are far more greater crimes. Nobody descended upon Clapper's house. What do you see of this kind of selective justice element of this in regards to some people are, let's say, beyond reproach despite their crimes, and other people are absolutely fair game, even when the crimes are not as significant?
Oh, I think you're spot on. If we have two tiers of justice, we do not have justice at all. These are high officials of the government who have systematically deceived the American public, who have committed grotesque crimes that should appall any American. Brennan was responsible for wiretapping the computers of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and was exposed as doing so. And it's not even just an allegation. I mean, it's admitted he did it. And at the time, McCain, Wyden, all these folks called for his head. But of course, he was Obama's point man in the type of manipulation and abuses of power that were committed, that we saw culminating in the FISA warrant, illegal FISA warrants, and the unmaskings and the spying and the use of our intelligence services as domestic political weapons. It's funny you mentioned the raid on Roger's house. CNN showed up there couple hours before, or at least an hour before the FBI.
We know they own psychics. Showed up. It's been clearly known that they own psychics because they have no other way of knowing, right? They're just randomly staring at his house when the cops raid.
Yeah. Their explanation does not hold water, and we know so because, in fact, in doing that, in leaking to CNN the raid on Rogers' house, a felony was committed to release the contents or anything concerning a felony search warrant, or any search warrant really, issued by a federal judge prior to its execution as a felony. Now, we know for a fact that at about 6 minutes after the raid was promulgated, I believe it was 6:06 a.m. When they kicked it off, and then about 6:13 or so, Grant Smith, who's a very straight shooting Florida attorney, a good man, has been Rogers' business attorney for many years, received a text from CNN, a CNN reporter, it escapes me here, I think it might have been Sarah Murray, in which she says, what do you have to say about this? And Grant didn't even know it had happened. So this was, he was being informed by CNN that his client had been, was being raided. And this is after, of course, they many times had said, look, if there is going to be a warrant issued for him, Roger will immediately surrender. He's, he owns no firearms. He's not a threat. I mean, he's no flight risk, not any of that. Like they said, we can do this. Just as, for example, Michael Avenatti, who clearly is a menace to the public, has defrauded his own clients as an attorney, was just quietly taken in by a couple of agents with no no raid, none of this. Grant Smith was contacted by Sarah Murray, and he said, well, I don't know anything about this. She then provided him immediately a copy of the indictment. Now it's a draft indictment. Now the indictment was not supposed to be unsealed until it's technically not until the search warrant and the arrest warrant are executed and then returned to the court, which happened later around 9 a.m., just after 9. So someone sent Sarah Murray this warrant and committed a felony in doing so. Now, we found in the metadata of the indictment, the initials, I believe, is AAW. Now, Andrew Weissman is the only person who fit those initials. Now, he was the power behind the throne of the Mueller witch hunt, boondoggle. And this man is ruthless. If you read, there's a book called, an entire book written by Harvey Silverglade called, and I believe Sidney Powell was involved in that, called 3 Felonies a Day. And it's about how Weissman just maliciously and vindictively went after Arthur Andersen in connection with the Enron and destroyed that company, cost thousands of people their livelihoods, and frankly, unjustly locked up some of their executives and kept them, in solitary confinement in order to squeeze them to obtain the results that they wanted. These people are not vicars or servants of justice. They are criminals, and they have been put into the highest positions of power. Andrew McCabe, we know, lied to his fellow agents in the covering up of this entire illegal warrant, FISA spying that was executed against Donald Trump's campaign. And I think they all just thought Hillary was going to win, and that it would all just go away. It would be disappeared into oblivion, which it would have had she won. But it wasn't, and it's been exposed. And Comey, all of them, they are not just simply, disgraced former officials. They are criminals, and their failure to prosecute them for these high crimes is and will remain a dangerous blight on the justice system in this country, and sets a terrible precedent. And it just, it appalls me when you have, for example, when Roger was, his sentence was commuted, thousands of, or whatever it was, former prosecutors who are lining up behind, Andrew Weissman and Zelensky and these very extremely crooked, corrupt people in positions of prosecutorial power, which hold immense power over life, liberty, and property. We're cheering them on and attacking the president. So when partisanship just is simply the only measure for whether justice can be had by an individual, we have no justice left in the country, and this has to be corrected. And frankly, it's not going to be corrected, I don't believe, under Joe Biden, who I've known for many years, who is, effectively now just a cipher for the worst, absolutely worst elements that have haunted and crept around Washington, D.C. for the last, 30 odd years or so, and given us the result that we have now, which is a thoroughly corrupt Justice Department, in my opinion. And not to say there aren't good people, who are laboring away, junior level attorneys, FBI agents, but the top, all the way up to the top, is just it's really a swamp. There's no other better way to say it, and something has to be done about it because we have. They should just call it. They should call it the Law Enforcement Department, something else. But calling it the Justice Department is a disgrace and certainly a misnomer.
Tyler, look, I agree with you. I think Joe Biden is, he is the swamp creature of the swamp creature, and he is going to load that swamp with creatures that have been there for the last 50 years. I honestly, look, it just seems like with the people he put in those positions, of the various, spots and everything else, these guys are like, contractors. These guys are lobbyists. Basically the worst elements of this kind of corporate state stuff that he's just bringing back in. When WikiLeaks, I don't know if you remember this, WikiLeaks put out that that Obama cabinet was basically chosen by Citigroup. And this is why Obama was out there screaming about hope and change and attacking bankers and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't think Biden will be any different. Let's do this. Let's take a break. Tyler P. Nixon is an archivist, activist, technologist, and legal counsel for Roger Stone. You can follow Tyler on Twitter at @RealTylerNixon. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and the voice of Tyler Nixon, our guest for this segment and the last. Tyler P. Nixon is an archivist, activist, technologist, and legal counsel to Roger Stone. And you can follow Tyler on Twitter at @RealTylerNixon. Tyler, a bunch of different directions we could go in at this point. Could continue talking about Biden. We could even talk about the stimulus check. I'm going to go, 50 plus, almost 60 years back into the past at this point. Just correct me if I'm wrong briefly, yes or no. You were working with Roger Stone on a book about JFK, right? That's part of what connects you two. Am I right in that?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I met Roger Stone, believe it or not, when I was 13 years old in New York City in October of 1984. I was a young Reagan volunteer, and my father had taken us from Delaware to New York he was a dentist, a very renowned pioneering cosmetic aesthetic dentist, and he had a conference in Manhattan, and little nerd that I was, or geek that I was, I said, well, I'm here in Manhattan for hours while my father's doing this conference, and what do I do with myself? I found the Midtown Manhattan, I guess, Reagan Bush headquarters, and went in to volunteer for a few hours. And I remember I think her name was Diane Hall or Diane Wolf. Anyway, she was the sort of volunteer coordinator for the office. And she said, "Oh, your name's Nixon. There's someone you might like to meet." And she takes me over, and I just remember vaguely this skinny guy with kind of blonde, sort of, I don't want to say stringy hair, but Roger had his hair kind of like he had longish hair back then, and just shaking his hand. And it was Nixon, huh? He's like, "Well, maybe you have a future in politics," and just Roger wasn't much for probably coddling a 13-year-old, but I just remember meeting him. And then fast forward to 2014, I've studied since that that time when I was a little kid, the Kennedy assassination, very, very closely, to the point that, I mean, I would almost consider myself expert, not a researcher, but certainly expert on all of the aspects of it and every, the information. I've gone to the conferences for years. Roger had just written The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. And I said, I had a radio show myself back in Delaware at the time on a Fox affiliate. And I said, I got to get this guy on, because I had been featuring some of the prominent authors for long form interviews in the field, and contacted him. And he said, "Oh, I'd love to come on." And we just hit it off from there. And it sort of has blossomed into a collaborative relationship for the last at least 6 years.
That's fascinating. That's very interesting. That's a very interesting backstory. And it's funny. Yeah, it's funny that you met back in the day. Okay, so I'm wrong factually, I'm wrong technically, but it's what brought you back together. It's not how you met, but it seems to be what brought you into a greater degree of contact. Here's why I was asking that. Along with the sort of clamor by some for Trump to pardon Assange, there's also been a long-term clamor, again, by a small but vocal minority, that Trump release the JFK files in full. If he were to do that, I mean, first of all, do you think that's at all plausible that he would do that? The timeline for that at this point, despite past guarantees, we're getting pretty close up to the hilt right now. If you were to do that, what do you think would be the follow-on ramifications for the intelligence community and for America as such? America as a government looking back at its past and its future, forward to its future. Tyler.
Sure. Well, I would dispute one thing when you said a vocal minority. I think there's a minority that is vocal, but I think if you were to poll the American public, you would find an overwhelming supermajority of people want those records released that have been withheld and classified and cubbied away in the bowels of the CIA for nearly well over 50 years at this point. I think that President Trump. So what happened was in 1992. They created the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, to basically go through and make sense of all of the documents surrounding the Kennedy assassination. Oliver Stone had just done his movie JFK. There was immense public support to find out what happened, to get to the bottom of it, what our government knew, when they knew it, and what agencies perhaps were, affiliated or involved in the assassination one way or another, or at least people or elements within agencies of our government. And they put a 25-year moratorium on releasing everything, which came to toll, or came due, so to speak, in 2017. So, Roger and I both worked on petitioning the president to release everything. And of course, the intelligence community got involved, and what we ended up having was a limited release. There were some new documents that came out, but nothing mind-blowing, of course. And, the fact that they want to keep documents and records confidential or concealed or classified over 50 years later is really troubling, because, I'm sorry, but there's no sources or methods or all the individuals involved that would be named or have been dead, many for decades now. So what are you hiding? What is there to hide here? And what's crazy is when they do finally release documents, often that have been heavily redacted, we find that it's innocuous stuff that didn't need to be redacted, should never have been redacted. But here's my view is that whatever there is to be found in the records, certainly of the CIA, has long been scrubbed. George H.W. Bush took the helm of the CIA, I believe, around 1975. Brief tenure, but as I understand it, the first thing he did when he got into the office was to order the records brought to him, of the Kennedy, related to the Kennedy assassination. So, there's just been too much time in which I think, and any smoking gun has long since been either destroyed or buried. We know, for example, that the Secret Service, when at the time the Records Review Board said you need to preserve all of your presidential detail logs that chronicle what happened on every presidential trip, when they were asked for and demanded by court order, I believe it was around that time, 92. They destroyed them. They destroyed these records. Literally, the Secret Service just to boxes full
Hey,
of
real quick, Tyler. Sorry for interrupting you. This is intensely fascinating, but we're getting a weird sort of mechanical whining noise that usually comes from interference, that kind of thing. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Occasionally, if you're talking, you're recording into a microphone, something like that, and it's too close to a cell reception. Anyway, I'm really just pausing to give you enough time to hopefully, if there's some obvious source of that, for you to reposition, because I want you to continue this what you're saying. This is fascinating. Let's try this again. Tyler, you with us? Oh man, we're trying to call him back. It's very interesting stuff, Jamarl.
It is a very interesting conversation. I mean, to put it mildly, I'm even curious on this. It's funny when he said all of the people are dead, and I was thinking Ted Cruz's dad is not dead. Donald Trump, when he was running in the primary against Ted Cruz, he called his wife ugly. He said that his uncle or dad was responsible or culpable in killing Kennedy. Like, it was some weird stuff that Trump was saying. And then at the end of it, to have Ted Cruz sitting under the Trump Pence banner asking for people to vote for Trump and Pence. Oh, the indignity of it all. But no, it's fascinating. I mean, there's this other aspect of Trump as an alpha male. He always fails on this stuff. Like, what did he say? I'm going to bring the troops home. He didn't do it. He couldn't do it for whatever reason. What did he say? I'm going to open the files. Didn't do it. Couldn't do it. Or is it he didn't do it? Like, what is it? It's either the presidency is not as strong as we think it is, meaning there's all sorts of limits that are on the powers of the presidency, which I think is true. I think it's extremely true.
Definitely not.
Yeah, I think it's extremely true.
Definitely not. Presidency, the office of the presidency is definitely not as strong as we think it is, especially right now. I mean, that's the whole, when the phrase the deep state is used, when you talk about a permanent state, sort of underbelly of the intelligence class, bureaucracy that, runs things, that's in some sense what you're talking about is this, it's its own power, a power behind the throne, this sort of eminence grise kind of a thing, where it is stronger than the executive, stronger than the legislative, and stronger than the judiciary, because it is able to use all of them as a vehicle for its interests. And, there are disagreements about its extent or its efficacy, its potency, how strong it is within the state. But it seems undeniable that it exists. I think we have Tyler back with us. Didn't mean to cut you off there. Let's try this again. Can you join us for a second, Tyler? Just want to make sure the audio is good. What were you saying?
Sure, I sure can. Can you hear me all right? A little better
Absolutely.
This time?
100% better. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. But what I was saying was that the Secret Service destroyed all of its logs for that period of, I think it was something like July of '63 through the end of that year. That's just that's indefensible. They knew, they were told to, and only that period, by the way, and not like, wholesale. Well, we just destroyed all records before, X date. That's criminal activity. And, that really speaks very poorly of the Secret Service as an institution at the time that they destroyed the records. And certainly, with the fact that, the detail at the time have come out with books, the Kennedy detail, and have sort of romanticized that era. These guys should have never been heard from again. They failed at the one job they had, and the president was grotesquely murdered right, in front of his wife in public, has his brains blown out literally on the streets of Dallas. So, there's so much murk and muck within the last 50 to 60 years, really since Kennedy's assassination, that lies in these records. But I tend to think that just like those records were destroyed, I think, and you'll never find a smoking gun even if you released everything. Now, maybe there's something that people wouldn't understand. Smoking gun. And I think that's the fear, is like there's probably no experts on the Kennedy assassination necessarily within the CIA at this point, at least not to the extent that I've seen amongst the great researchers and analysts who've written books and dissected this for decades and really have made it their life's passion and mission. Some of whom are still alive and meet every. This is the only year they haven't met in at least a decade in Dallas because of the. COVID-19 stuff. So it'd be nice to think that we would have the truth on that definitively, but I don't think it will ever come out that we'll be able to definitively say, yes, absolutely, it was these people. But I think they've managed to vector it in based on just the different testimonies that have come out, like Howard Hunt, who fingered people who were working in the CIA at the time as being sort of the designers and who put it all
Tyler,
together.
But we're going to have to end it here. I appreciate you coming on, man. Tyler P. Nixon is an archivist, activist, technologist, and legal counsel for Roger Stone. You can follow Tyler on Twitter @RealTylerNixon. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this week, one of the last hours this year of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our divided states, as well as across the divided states that span our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into the headlines. In the news this morning, first up in COVID news, as of yesterday at about 12:30 p.m., the CDC COVID tracker reported 18,170,000 total COVID cases and 321,734 deaths. Those include 3,165 new deaths. California has become the first state to hit 2 million COVID cases. This came just 6 weeks after hitting the 1 million mark. More than 23,500 Californians have died from the virus since the pandemic began. Because of the COVID lockdown, states around the U.S. are facing steep deficits and little federal aid in sight. The shift to remote work could give many cash-strapped states a legitimate way to bring back much-needed tax revenue. So a group of states joined a U.S. Supreme Court battle that could determine whether jurisdictions can tax the income of remote workers who are no longer commuting to the office. Tomorrow, I'm going to read the rest of this headline, but I was looking into this, and we can have a short convo after. New Jersey, along with Connecticut, Hawaii, and Iowa, submitted an amicus brief on Tuesday in a lawsuit that challenges the authority of states to tax non-residents' income while they've been working from home. At the center of the controversy is a court case between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The Bay State has been taxing New Hampshire residents who have been working remotely since the pandemic, spurring the Granite State to file suit against Massachusetts in October. New Jersey's brief supports New Hampshire's position. The brief also pushes back on New York, which taxes Garden State residents who normally commute there, even though many are now working from home. So your first interpretation was totally right. I was wrong. I was misreading this. Specifically, here's how it works. You have these 7 states who basically tax on where the employer is based. So say, again, I'm living in New Jersey and I'm working in New York. I will be taxed on that income in New York. And the way that New Jersey handles it is they give me a tax credit. They would normally tax me on that stuff, but they give me a tax credit because, you don't want double taxation. And what's happening is that as a bunch of, partly this works because people are having to drive into New York, so they're using New York's roads. And so, infrastructurally, in terms of services and the provision of essential services, there's a reason for one state to charge the tax and the other state to not. But of course, as people are working at home, that reason has sort of faded away because they're entirely living and working in the state of their residence. And so there's this battle over who gets to tax whom and whether these tax credits should apply or whether New York should temporarily, for instance, just taking them as an example, or Massachusetts for that matter, whether they should be allowed to tax people who aren't coming in to work in their cities, even though the employer is based there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. That makes sense. I mean, basically, what you said, it makes sense. I guess the question becomes, what's the answer? I mean, if I'm living in Maryland and let's say I'm working remotely somewhere, like you said, technically I'm not using their infrastructure and everything else, but the company is there. And so it's like if the company creates a job in New York and the people who work that job are in India, do their labor get taxed by New York? Like you said, they're not using any of that stuff. And let's say you take it to Maryland. I mean, I guess the question becomes, God, that's so interesting. I mean, is it the job or the location that I guess matters? And by the way, if you weren't, let's say they didn't do that. Let's say, okay, fair enough. This job, the state can't necessarily tax the individual, so they're not going to tax the person. So the state that they're living in is going to tax them for a job that is not in that state. This just seems a little weird all the way around. Like that, this is a little confusing all the way around in regards to the tangled web. All of these states, of course, they're going to want the revenue. And I agree with you. If you're driving on their roads, if you're using their services, etc., then fair enough. You have an argument to make that, look, the company is here, the labor is here, everything that has been done for the most part is here, and we're taxing that stuff here. But what happens when that goes away? Do you still get the tax to people despite the fact that they're not using your infrastructure and everything else? Is it really just where the company is based? That's an interesting one. I got to be honest. I don't know where I fall on that. I have to think about that one. Oh, what do you think? What's your point of view of this?
Part of what additionally complicates things is that a lot of employers are registered in like completely different states. So like a lot of employers, for instance, at a corporation specifically, are registered in Delaware, even though that's not where they conduct their operations. Now, it's certainly not where the employees are living in a lot of these cases. So it's like loopholes within loopholes, epicycles within epicycles. And just imagine how complicated it would be. And this is somewhat random, but the whole open borders thing. I mean, I understand there are arguments to be made for it. You know, admittedly, that's not ever an argument we've had on the air. But just imagine how hellishly complicated things would get, where you're not just having to deal with competing taxes in states, but competing taxes in countries, and potentially between different states and countries.
It gets very weird.
You know, anyway.
Yeah, it gets very weird.
Does.
I mean, and like you said, the loophole, like Ireland, like a lot of companies are based in Ireland because of their tax code. And Delaware, same thing apparently. Delaware, if I could be wrong, but the tax code is favorable, so companies will register themselves there. But are they working there?
100%.
Right. It's like if they're not working there, let's say they're working in New York, who taxes? Is it Delaware that's taxing because the company is technically founded, based supposedly in Delaware? Or is it New York? How do they even know? Like all of this stuff comes into play in regards to how these guys appropriate tax for the various states. No, this is a fascinating case the more I think about it.
In Silicon Valley, for like venture capitalists, what they will often recommend that startups do is that they register themselves as a Delaware, I believe it's a C Corp, a specific type of corporation in Delaware, because it makes it easy for outside parties basically to invest money and get ownership. And it's, you know, this is a recommendation that's given. It's literally on the like opposite side of the country. And it's a decently large country. So it's just weird to think about, like one of the new major power centers in the U.S. very prominently recommending that a bunch of startups register from across the other side of the country. It feels like a loophole within a loophole. But as long as Delaware is happy, I guess the system continues. And as long as the federal government is very happy to take part in the rise in the occasional taxation of these new upstart startup companies, then everybody just kind of goes along to get along. Anyway. We have more headlines to get to here. Yesterday, Trump pardoned 26 more people and commuted sentences of 3 more people. I'm not going to go through this whole list. There's a long list. The list includes, however, at the top, former campaign chair Paul Manafort, convicted of financial fraud and conspiring to obstruct the investigation of his crimes. Longtime friend Roger Stone, whose clemency was upgraded to a full pardon, who was convicted during the Mueller investigation. And Charles Kushner, father of Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, pled guilty to making false statements to the Federal Election Commission, witness tampering, and tax evasion. Again, many more pardoned on this list, and really coming from all different corners of the convicted section of our national legal system. Anyway, next headline here: calls for Julian Assange to be pardoned by U.S. President Donald Trump are on the rise, with activists, journalists, writers, campaigners, and politicians from across the ideological spectrum demanding that the WikiLeaks publisher be freed during the final days of the current administration. Some German legislators have formed the Free Julian Assange Working Group. This amid growing calls for the WikiLeaks publisher to be pardoned by U.S. President Donald Trump. Christian Mier of Reporters Without Borders, which has been monitoring Assange's extradition hearings, announced the formation of the cross-party group in the Bundestag. on the 21st of December, just 3 days ago. The letter says that the working group was founded, quote, out of great concern for the life of journalist and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who has been in solitary confinement and in critical condition for over 18 months at the high-security Belmarsh prison in the UK, and whose extradition to the U.S. is to be decided upon on the 4th of January 2021, end quote. That's, 11 days away at this point. It's coming up on us. It's pretty darn close, 10 days away. I think it's 11. Assange's mother, who recently announced that she would stop using social media for her own good, nevertheless took to Twitter to thank the MPs and others for all their hard work on the issue. The announcement from Germany comes at the same time that a group of Australian MPs and senators signed an open letter to President Trump calling on him to either pardon Assange or drop the prosecution case against him. I'm going to quote from that letter here, quote, Assange has fought for truth and justice. His work with WikiLeaks has pioneered accountability by the media and exposed corruption, civil liberties violations in the United States and around the world, and the true cost of war, end quote. It has exposed that. And it's sad to see WikiLeaks having slowed down over recent years. A couple of interesting conversations talking about this briefly earlier today with Tyler Nixon. Also talking about this yesterday with, I believe, Maram Sousli. Yes, it was with Maram Sousli yesterday. More good conversations. By the way, we do these good interviews every day. You should really listen to them. If you're listening to the show, I'm guessing you do. Anyway, that's a complete absurdity. Boris Johnson is set to address his nation on Thursday morning as the UK and the EU are set to be close to clinching a Brexit deal. The agreement will let the UK trade freely with the EU without tariffs or quotas. But, a lot of the kinks need to be worked out. Chief spokesman of the European Commission, Eric Mamer, said earlier that the European Union and the United Kingdom will continue the work on the post-Brexit trade agreement throughout the night last night, as media reports suggested that the deal could be reached in the early hours of today. London had made significant concessions in the talks, including on these stumbling fishery issues within the past 24 hours. Earlier, the EU Council had begun the procedure for preparing for the implementation of a potential trade agreement with the UK, which should come into force on the 1st of January, but only if the European Parliament and the British Parliament have time to ratify it between Christmas and New Year. If London and Brussels find no common ground by the 31st of December, the UK will no longer be under the EU's trade rules, and the World Trade Organization's rules will instead come into force for both sides in 2021. Those include custom tariffs and full border checks for goods flowing across the English Channel. Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney said there had been, quote, some sort of last-minute hitch, end quote, over the small print of the fishing quotas agreement, but that a deal was still expected later. In my last headline this morning, an anti-monopoly investigation has been initiated against Chinese e-commerce giant, Alibaba Group, Jack Ma's Alibaba Group. The State Administration for Market Regulation said on Thursday, and a quote here from that authority, the State Administration for Market Regulation, in accordance with the received complaint, has initiated an investigation against Alibaba Company on suspicion of a monopoly, end quote. Ma's offer did not help to salvage the IPO since Beijing was angered by his criticism of the government's excessive regulations in the national financial industry, which he viewed as a major obstacle for the growth of new financial services and innovations. That's the classic dynamic, isn't it? Is the owners of big companies being frustrated that the government is regulating them? Just pointing that out here and abroad. It's a constant. Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly personally ordered Chinese regulators to study possible risks posed by Ant Group and suspend the IPO. Co-founder of Alibaba Group, Jack Ma, offered to hand over parts of his financial technologies giant Ant Group to the Chinese government in an attempt to save the company's initial public offering, that's their IPO, that was suspended by the Shanghai Stock Exchange back on the 3rd of November. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Real quick, I'm gonna go back into the headlines in just a moment, I think. But we're going to be off the air this coming Friday and the Friday after that. This Friday, tomorrow, is Christmas Day. That's a federal holiday here in the U.S., so we're not going to be on. Don't freak out. We are still alive. We are still a functional show. We're just not going to be on the air. And the same holds true for next Friday, New Year's Day, which is also a federal holiday, the first day of 2021. Sadly, we'll have to wait until, what is that, the 4th? The Monday after, to inaugurate 2021 with some surely excellent show, first show of 2021. That'll be exciting, won't it, Jamarl?
Yes, it's the holidays. It's one day off. What are you doing for the weekend? Are you ready for the whole Christmas break and everything else, or not so much. You said you were. I was reading this stuff earlier. You said you were traumatized by the whole Christmas.
I'm never ready.
Well, explain to the audience why you're so traumatized by Christmas. This was hilarious to me.
Well, I know it's because Santa never visits. It's because every year there's this promise made in movies, made to the general public, made to me consistently as a child. Not really. I'm just kidding. That Santa's going to visit, and he never does. And when he does, it's usually in a mall. And he does not look nearly as animatronic as the Santas I've seen in the movies that I've watched. And he's a lot, he's just not the St. Nicholas I'm used to. And so he never visits.
If you had a kid, would you lie to your kid about Santa?
No.
Tell him to do from day one? Because I get the feeling, because my wife always joked with me that my kid would be the one who goes into school and be like, Santa doesn't exist, and be screaming at the other kids and making them cry.
No, don't do that. No, and I could see you encouraging them. I would probably just encourage my child to feel superior to the other kids. But I couldn't do it, and they're like, I'm in on it. I know what these adults are up to, but none of these other kids, none of these other suckers do. But no, I mean, the thing is, you said tell them from day one. There is a question, when can you actually tell them? Because if you think about it, day one, they're not going to understand what you're talking about. They're like a newborn at that point. So when is day one? Is it when they're 3 years old? Is it when they're 2 years old? There's going to be a period where somebody else gets them excited about the idea of Santa existing, and you, the parent, have to come in and be like, nah, not actually the case. I don't, it's a complicated moral dynamic. Anyway, enough ado about that. We are going into a break. We will be back in just a minute with Manila Chan. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share that audio and video. Also, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss us. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. But joining us, again, I know I say this a lot, but many of the guests we bring on I like a lot. Manila Chan is one of them, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program In Question. And Manila, your show, and I think I've said this before, was one of the shows that was my gateway into RT. You and Rick Sanchez. I've always enjoyed your show. So the fact that you can come on to this one, I appreciate it. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jamarl. I didn't realize I was part of the gateway that led you into the.
No, I just mean online, different news bits will come up. And as I was, it's like one of those things where you get on kind of a wavelength at a certain point where it's like, oh, that person is receptive. Or that, it was that. It wasn't so much like a gateway drug. I didn't mean it in that context. I meant it purely the thing that allows you to appropriate new news in that case. No, your show is awesome.
I appreciate that.
No,
I appreciate that. And before we get into more heavy topics, can I weigh in on the Santa thing, being a new mom?
You can absolutely weigh in on the Santa thing.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm the child of immigrants. So my parents came to the U.S. I was born, and they were like, Santa, what is this? What's this Santa business? They're like, no, we work hard. We bought you the gift. So I always went to school. I was the kid, like you said, Jamarl, to go burst the bubble of all these kids at school going, that dude isn't real. And I probably am not going to tell my son that Santa is real. I'm probably going to let him know that, he's symbolic of other things relating to Christmas. And I think, I'm not saying one way is better than the other, but I think for me, that's how I would approach it, because I want him to understand symbolism and that not everything is what it seems. And that's okay, that this is part of the objective reality that I wish more people would participate in.
So I agree with you on that one. Here's another way of looking at this, and I'm curious to hear your take on this. It seems like it would be one of those formative moments in much of the West. If you live in a country that celebrates Christmas and that upholds the myth, the lovely myth that Santa Claus exists and has, his elves and reindeers, et cetera. It seems like one of those formative moments where that bubble gets burst, where you figure out that this whole thing is a lie, either your parents telling you or somebody else tells you. Like, and I'm meaning this kind of seriously, actually. It's like you have a kid, at some point you tell them, a lot of society is telling them that you're wrong, that this entity does exist. Does that affect the psyche? Does that affect the psychology of the kid at that point? What's your take on that?
I don't know. I guess you can be as screwed up as I am, not believing in Santa your whole life or the tooth fairy. But I think there are worse ways to be than like me. But I think for my son, I would like him to know that, about symbolism and why these stories exist, and to explore the hierarchy of story building and why these things are there. And I guess for my parents, I think for me, I interpreted the myth story as more of a means for control. And that's kind of what I thought my whole life, is that, your parents don't want to tell you the truth about Santa because they don't want to admit that they're actually in control of all of this, and that there are other powers that be. And that's kind of, been my guiding principle growing up. So for me, the no Santa story, I think, helped me unplug from the matrix very young.
Very interesting. And I can appreciate that. I think one of the greatest days of my life would be if I had a kid, and at 2 years old, he comes to me and says, why doesn't Santa like poor kids? And I could sit him down and explain to him, because there is no Santa Claus. Like, he's like, Santa Claus is a capitalist? Why does he hate the poor? That would be the greatest day of my life. But yeah, I agree with you. I want my kid to know that his parents are working very hard to get him this stuff. And that this is not a situation where a magical being is bestowing these gifts. And you have to ask, why doesn't this magical being bestow the gifts across the world? And why is he waiting on this one particular day? Why is he giving food? Like why is this magical being very specific to things that the poor doesn't necessarily need at that moment? No, I think it's very strange.
Exactly.
But let's do this. Let's get into the news. We feel like
I'm sorry. We're going to talk about this for a long time. Going, okay, but the have and have-nots, and Santa doesn't. Yeah, I hear you. I'm with you on that, Jamarl. 100%.
Yeah. So Trump is on his way out. Is Trump going to have an Eisenhower moment? Like, he's been trying to draw down. He's been getting significant pushback from it. He's been trying to pull troops out of Afghanistan and Syria. This was one of the campaign promises that Trump made to his base. His base enjoyed that campaign promise. The left agreed with him on that campaign promise. And yet, he seemed incapable of doing it as president of the United States. Is Donald Trump going to have this moment where he looks into the camera and talks about the threat of the military-industrial complex? And instead of using threat, it's not even a threat, more like it's here. So is Trump going to have that moment explaining the pushback that he's been getting for trying to do these things? Or is he just going to leave in a huff, still saying that he won the race? What do you think is going to happen here in these last few days? People want him to release Assange. They want him to release the files. They want him to do all this stuff, and they think he's the maverick to do it. What do you think? You think he's going to be that person?
Well, tagging on to the whole Santa conversation, I wish I could say I was a fortune teller. I wish I could say I had a crystal ball. But if we look into my fake crystal ball, I would say I would put my hopes in that he would just, as a lame duck, screw it. Burn the bridges, burn the establishment on your way out. He's already pardoned, 800,000 different people that were tied to his campaign, whether they're guilty of things or not, or, personal family like the Kushners. On your way out, why not? Why not pardon Snowden? Why not pardon Assange? You really want to get under the skin of the establishment and the swamp that you railed against, all 4 years? Then just do it. Let them free. Let them speak. Let them come back to America. Let them talk and burn it all. That's what I hope to see. I hope that he does have that watershed Eisenhower moment where he stares at the camera and just talks to us from the Oval Office and says all the things that he's been wanting to say the last 4 years, but realized he was in over his head and couldn't get past the swamp and couldn't get past Mitch McConnell. I hope he sits there and stares right at the camera, no teleprompter, and just says all the horrible things that he's been thinking, because we all want to see it, whether it's for a press moment or not. Stick to his campaign, his stump promises, and just let it all out, Don. Let it all out.
The CIA killed JFK. Aliens exist, and this is a natural tan.
Right.
I think that would be the closeout. No, it would be exciting. I mean, that's what a lot of people have been waiting for, literally since he entered the Oval Office. Of course, that's the vast majority of his base is waiting for him to make some major changes. Earlier on, we were talking about why he hasn't done so. And I think the conclusion we tentatively settled on, we had to get back into a conversation with a guest, but tentatively, was the whole deep state, permanent state argument that there is just this class of DC bureaucrats and members of various intelligence agencies who have constrained him at key points. And you can see that particularly with the troops, where trying to pull troops out of Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia. If you look at the case of Syria, for instance, the U.S. ambassador in Syria has said they kept the accurate troop numbers from Trump, literally kept that information from him. So that's just sort of one face of that, a sort of glimpse of what's going on there. What do you think is actually the case? Is it his fecklessness? Is it he's just been incapable of doing so? Or is it that there is this deep state that keeps hemming him in? Manila.
I would say that it's a combination of both. I think President Trump is actually smarter than most people want to give him credit for, but he's also not an experienced politician. I don't think he came here knowing what he was getting into. I think he was a little bit in over his head. And again, I'm not saying that he's a dumb guy or anything like that. I think he's just inexperienced with what really happens within the belly of the beast and how this place actually operates, that it cannot operate like a corporation. It is too big, it is too dysfunctional, and has too many self-interests of its own, independent of the executive branch. And I think he probably heard that those things existed, but didn't realize the beast was this big, the size that it is, that he can't control all these things like a chief executive. So I do think while there are real tangible consequences to pulling all the troops out all at once and kind of pulling the rugs out from under these fledgling governments that we've installed in various places, or pulling contracts away from the friends of the DoD like Boeing and Raytheon and what have you. There are tangible consequences to that, and I think President Trump has learned that he can't just say, nope, done, we're shutting this down, because people will get hurt. People will physically be hurt. We'll lose jobs. We'll lose incomes. We'll lose homes. There are consequences. So I think this was a trickier minefield to walk through than he realized when he first decided to throw his hat in the ring. But that said, now that he's been here 4 years and now that he sees, I think there's a lot more that he's capable of doing if he just gets the chutzpah to do it. Because at this point, again, he's a lame duck. There are a lot of rugs he should pull out and a lot of triggers should pull, because if somebody like him who is independently wealthy doesn't do it, nobody else will. And that will literally be what he is most remembered for in this as a single-term president and currently as a lame duck, if he wants to go down in history as the American badass, then that's what you do.
I hear you, and I think there is a moment. I think in some sense, with the speech that he already gave, defying the spending bill and the stimulus bill, with that, there's a sign, and some people might even say that was a moment like that, on par with that. I also completely hear and agree with what you were saying about his inexperience. We need to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. Follow her on Twitter, Manila Chan, on Facebook at Manila Chan Reports, and watch her show In Question on RT America. We will be back with her in just a minute on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question, Manila Chan. Again, welcome back. I want to get into something that you mentioned earlier. And it has to do with the difficulties and the complications of trying to do just the good thing, meaning bringing the troops home, or for that matter, cutting the military budget. Our budget is drastically more than most of the other nations combined, most of which are our friends. I think it was like 9 last time I checked, but most of which are our friends. And this has become, at a certain point, a jobs program, but it's a grim jobs program. What lefties, I think, don't necessarily get is cutting the military budget in and of itself is not as simple as just cutting the military budget. Doing so means stopping various people in various states around the United States from getting paid. That means you're basically cutting jobs in those states. And unless there's something to compensate for the fact that those jobs are going to be cut because the federal government is not going to be dumping billions into those companies, well, your country has to mitigate that. The money that you are spending for the troops that are abroad shooting and doing this and that and staying in these locations, if you shut down military bases, those people still going to need jobs and payment. I don't think we entirely get that the military is not just a device for protection of the nation. At this point, it's become basically a job. How do we get ourselves out of that, especially in a situation where cutting the budget is basically going to be, you're going to be attacked for it, and the various states that have people working at those bases or working at companies that build those boats and ships and guns and bullets and et cetera, et cetera. And at some point, it became easier to just drop money to them, let the people work at those jobs, and let the military and the country, especially from a geopolitical standpoint, do as it may. How do we unravel that?
Well, I would say to move forward with breaking down the military-industrial complex, because like you said, Jamarl, it is tantamount to a white-collar jobs program, mostly for these executives that go around, the Saudi Arabia selling our weapons so they can go bomb the poor people in Yemen. But what the U.S. did and it's not a Trump problem, and it wasn't a strictly Obama problem. This goes back 30, 40 years, right? When the U.S. took its eyes off the ball and decided we're not going to be a nation of scientists and doctors and people that start businesses and factories anymore. we decided to become the greatest net exporter of democracy. And that is how the military-industrial complex came to be over the past 40 years, right? We decided that, okay, we're going to bomb everybody into submission until they buy our democracy. You will buy our F-35. You are going to buy our missile defense systems, because this is American democracy. And that is what the U.S. is focused on. So, of course, if you keep looking in that direction, guess what? Our education, in the meantime, on the other side of this, used to be number one in the world 40, 50 years ago. We have dropped down, I believe, somewhere in the 20s, behind so many countries in Latin America, primarily behind China. So in the interim, it is going to suck. It's going to burn a lot of white collar folks and some of the more blue collar hands-on folks that are building these machines, these people on the assembly line. It is going to suck for many of those people. But then you have scores of tens of millions of children who 10, 15, 20 years from now will be able to rebuild the America that we claim was so great, then rebuild America so that Americans can be self-sufficient, not because we're independent from these other countries that we're bombing. Make us independent, make us self-sufficient again, so that way America can be productive again and children can get their families out of poverty again. And I don't think in the modern day, selling your democracy bombs is the way to do it. I think reappropriating some of those funds within our own borders is probably the smarter way to go as a long-term investment. But again, it's going to suck in the short term.
And that's why that's a massive hump to get over. That's why, I agree with you completely. If there were one major change that I could make in American politics and our economy, it would basically fit the trajectory that you just said. Something like a swords to plowshares program with our economy, with our political system. But if you have a system that is built to produce one kind of good, it takes work to fit it to produce another kind of good. And all the more so if you're not just talking about a machine, a mechanical system, but a political system, the whole body of laws and incentives. I don't want to make too much out of it, but I think you agree with me that it would definitely be an effort. There's a big hurdle to cross there. What would it take? Anything on the horizon in terms of political movement, political momentum? What do you think it would take? How could we get there? Manila, looking, going into the end of the year, going into the holiday season, trying to make things a little bit rosier after a absolutely horrendous year in 2020. What would it take? Any sign that we can get there, Manila?
I think right now, with the whole country basically effectively on lockdown because of COVID-19 this whole year, 2020 has kind of been the lost year, right? So I think there is not a lot of political will or desire even to look that far into the future, to invest in the future, because that's really what it is an investment in America's future, in America's families and the children that, perhaps the parents were unable to get out of poverty, but you can encourage the children to change the trajectory. But that takes a lot of guts and a lot of being able to stomach the hard times for the short term. And I think right now, American politicians don't have the ability to see past right now and using this current COVID crisis as a political football, like all major crises become on Capitol Hill. They usually become a political football. And when you look at all these, the spending bills and the talking points of $600 versus $2,000, and, if people really parse through those highlighted talking points, you come to find out that people like Nancy Pelosi have really punted on this. They've kicked the can down the road since this summer until they got through the election. I feel like she didn't want to put this stimulus package or this omnibus bill at the feet of Joe Biden. But these are all, again, short term. This is all in the next few months, right? They wanted to get through one phase at a time versus everybody just agreeing that what America has been doing the past 30 years, making enemies of the good, enemies of countries that we should be in cooperation with, like Russia and China, making enemies of them, or at the very least, in China's case, a frenemy, that maybe that's not the best way to go. And, if you look at Democrats, they say that the Russians are bad. You look at Republicans and they say, well, China's bad. China's our enemy. I wish everybody on Capitol Hill had the political will and the political guts to just agree that this is political theater, and the only way to move forward is by unanimous cooperation. I mean, you can go in there and point out, the republic, the right to life, the right to choose. You can figure all that out later. But if your focus right now is getting America through this hump, this COVID crisis, you can look at that, but look further down the line about how it's impacting America 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Not just how are people going to feed themselves today, but there is a longer term consequence to the U.S. being unable to stop this political theater. And that is the saddest part, because we, the working people of this country, can't survive. We just can't do this the way it's going. Capitol Hill has become crazier and crazier, and the fighting, not only infighting within each party, but the constant finger pointing has gotten to a level, I would say, and I've been here almost 10 years, is at a level that literally the Congress can't do anything. People always say the do nothing Congress. This is literally the saddest congressional class I have seen in the past several years. Nothing has been done. Everybody's been stifled because of COVID. Nobody's willing to look past the short-term talking points. And that's where we're at. And that's why 10 years from now, if nothing gets done now, 10 years from now, we're going to be in a worse off position.
I don't think people realize how weird it is to have a government that can't function. Like, Democrats and Republicans agree on issues of, class and capital and those type of things. They're very clear. We're capitalists. That's what we are. We push for market-based solutions to pretty much everything. And there may be a gradient between the Republicans and Democrats, but basically the party is the same. But I agree with you that theater has started to take precedent over reality. I mean, I think this is from a standpoint of even black politics. That, like, if you think of the 60s, and it was crucial to get an African-American face in a position of authority because those people were kept out of those positions. And when the argument and the conversation was basically race-related, then it made sense for you to focus on identity, because that person putting in the office implicitly and explicitly is working in your best interest just by definition, because he's working in his own interests. But now, that theater still goes on in black politics. And instead of looking at this and says, okay, we've moved beyond this point of just trinkets in various positions, we're at the point where it needs to be a focus on issues of class. We need to deal with the economic realities of our system and how those economic realities show disadvantages to various groups. But they don't do that. They stay with the shiny trinket of, here's a black person in that position, here's a gay person in that position, here's a trans person in that position. Aren't you happy? Aren't you excited by it? We're the Democratic Party. And it's like, well, wait, keep Kamala Harris, give me health care. I'll take that. And it's like, no, that's racist. Right. That's not racist at all. I want health care. And it's that nonsense where it's like, in lieu of doing something real and actual, you get theater. Whether it's on that issue, whether it's on the bill, this nonsense slap in the face bill that they put up, it seems to be ensconced where they have no longer the ability to do anything real for the American public. At this point, it just becomes optics. Where does this lead us? We have about a minute.
Well, on that note, you're absolutely right, Jamarl. This giant, tremendous bill that they're putting forth in the 11th hour, the 5,500-page bill, that is 15 copies of Moby Dick stacked, okay? So you tell me how anybody can get through that in 1 day, 2 days, 3 days now, with all the different riders and appropriations that they put in there?
2 to 6 hours, apparently.
26 whole hours.
No. 2 to 6 hours, depending on who you're listening to. Yeah.
Right. Right. I don't care how big your staff is. Nobody's getting through 15 copies of Moby Dick in less than easily, at least a week or two, at least. So there are a lot of things that are the riders that are attached to this, these pork barrel spending that has all been built into this. And the Democrats have really missed an opportunity there because they have backed down from language within those this bill and those riders to push back on women's choice, to push back. They've really, really stepped back. And maybe it's a concession they had to make. I don't know what happened behind closed doors. But from what I can see is that they have made these kinds of concessions that nobody's reporting on just to get the talking points of a $2,000 stimulus check out there. But for the greater good, what else is in there? And that's what I think people need to explore if they can stomach 15 copies of Moby Dick.
And, speaking of that, if you look back, like in 2008, 2007, anytime there's been something that has gone on and they put pressure on Congress, it usually turns out bad. Meaning usually it's something horrible in that bill that they don't want people to see, that they don't want to give time to explore. It's usually something that's a giveaway. I mean, those are type of things where Congress gets all this pressure. We got a better bailout. We have to have a bailout right now. The world is going to come to an end if we don't do it. And then the pressure is applied to Congress, and Congress goes through, and you find out later all of the stuff that was in the bill that nobody got a chance to talk about. Manila, you're absolutely right. Manila Chan is a veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program In Question. You can follow Manila on Twitter at Manila Chan, on Facebook at Manila Chan Reports, and watch her show In Question on RT America. Manila, again, thank you for joining us. You guys are listening to
Merry
Fault Lines.
Christmas. Happy holidays.
Oh, absolutely. Same to
you too. Merry Christmas.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. Last 15-minute call-in segment of the year. Hope everybody's having a good one. At least a good day, that is. The year's been rather messy, pretty deadly for a lot of people. Anyway, 202-521-1320 is the number. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. I believe we have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif from NOLA, you're on the air. What's on your mind, man?
I got a couple of things to say. Everybody, I got a link underneath Fault Lines radio link for today. Call and email the White House to support Julian Assange, whistleblowers, activists, and innocent people. Email them and call them. I'm calling them today. Yesterday, I emailed them. And also, I like to say declassify everything. Okay, Trump should declassify everything. And also, my name is Tyree Simon. I'm a VA whistleblower. I need a lawyer, and also to take out an ad or a commercial in the New Orleans area, in the Houston area. I'm looking for people that know any information about Mikey and Becky dealing with the contaminated water. If they saw anything, and also to show my face on the commercial saying if you know anything about this man, of his name being smeared or anything that Mikey DeBakey, call his number. But I know that's going to take money and time to set up in the New Orleans area and also the Houston area. That will also help build up my case. I know I said this last month, but I'm saying it again. That's how you get the ball rolling. Pardon Julian Assange, declassify COINTELPRO, declassify MLK, Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy files, all the files. Even though some of them might be missing, You still got this man named Garrison, Jim Garrison. He did work. Maybe some of his files still around. You have other investigators. We can work together as a team. And yes, it is a beast of a system, like Manetta Chan was saying, but guess what? It's 330 million of us. We outnumber them. We put our minds together, and we can expose them for who they are. And this will never happen to humanity again. Once we expose them and put them in jail, and we can go on and get Medicaid for all, in all wars, in all homeless, in the United States and throughout the world. We can work together to go to space and live like champs, like the Creator wants us to live. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Thank you for the call to Reef Simon. That is a Fault Lines Christmas prayer if I ever heard one. We've got other calls, but I'm in agreement with the vast majority of what he just had to say. We're still taking calls, by the way.
But I don't think, Tarif, yes, I like that. Clearly, I like that. I'm a Star Trek geek, if you ever know one. You can look in my wall. But I don't think time ends like that, which means that even in the best of societies, there's going to be chaos. The idea that it never happens again, I don't buy it. It means even if you got your society right, even if society got, let's say, decent, even what we would consider to be utopia, there will still be fights and environmental back and forths among people, even of good characters and good grace. Like, it's like anywhere you are is where you are. I don't think there's a way out of the box like that. I mean, it's like human beings and like satisfaction. There's no way to be satisfied as a person. The moment that you accomplish something, the thing gets owed and you want something else. It's like just, it's
and yet that is enlightenment itself. And I hear you. And yet, you know, by realizing that you have a much greater chance of attaining lasting happiness. I don't think everything is a hedonic treadmill. That's another term for it. You know, I don't think everything is okay. You know, you move up to a much higher standard of living. You move up to a much higher degree of safety, whatever the case may be, and automatically you're back to normal after enough time passes. I think that there are categorical leaps. Otherwise, people wouldn't. Frankly, I don't think it's just the pursuit. I think it is partially the attainment too, and it's both. It's both. Anyway, this is getting rather philosophical rather quickly. We've got a couple more calls to get in. I don't want to jump in, but this is a conversation we have every once in a while, and it keeps on going. Hopefully, it will keep on going for a while yet. We have Patty calling in from Kansas City. 202-521-1320 is the number. Patty, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Well, hi. Thank you for taking my call. This is not real important, but it comes up every Christmas in my family that my daughter was tortured all through school because in first grade, she told the kids Santa wasn't real. She's now 31, and we talk about it every Christmas season, how they treated her at school.
That's so funny.
How they treated her at school. It was a little school. I was a single parent with 4 children. She was the youngest, so she knew Santa wasn't real. And how they treated her for the next 8 years was terrible.
Patty, I would say this, though. The caveat that I've always added is that any kid that I have is also going to have self-defense at a very early age. Because I understood at very early on, if you're going to stand on your own, if you're going to be able to take a position and hold that position, you need to be able to defend yourself from a crowd that is not as bright as you and your kid. And so I always had those things in tandem with one another. I didn't necessarily think people could be individuals without the capacity to defend their individuality. So I get that. That's horrible. That's horrible. But he was right. And just because you're right doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be rewarded for being right. I think that's one of those horrible lessons that you learn, that your kid learned at a very early age. What do you think, Shade?
Torture doesn't sound good. Yeah, the social castigation, being an outcast like that, especially, I mean, and this is, if you're in school, this is one of my problems with school. You're effectively stuck there for a number of years with just a random assortment of people, a more or less random assortment of other people who, statistically can be all sorts of different ways, and they can be mean. And if you resist them, if you resist their pressure, if you speak out in favor of what you believe is right, namely Santa Claus not actually being a real thing and all of this being a lie, then they're going to react to you, and you're going to be stuck with them. And it's in some sense it is a uniquely authoritarian environment to put our young children and soon to be adults through, and to prepare them for for the wider world. That's an indictment of school. That sounds ugly, Patty. I'm sorry to hear that she had to go through that. All I can do is thank you for telling her the truth, and hopefully that helped her to develop her own sense of identity, her own sense of self-esteem, her own sense of independence from the crowd. I think that's part of what Jamarl was talking about there. We have other callers.
Wait,
and only a couple of minutes
left. Is
left.
that an indictment of school or of human beings? That sounds like a human thing. Like, I've watched the Jimmy Dore stuff. How do you watch that and not come away with, yeah, that's just a person thing? Those are people. Like, because think about what happened for the moment. You had a situation where a clique started to develop immediately. If you didn't agree with everything that was put in it, then you were on the outs. A list goes around with snake emoji saying that these people are snakes because these people disagree with this particular idea, despite agreeing with the healthcare and all this other stuff. That happened almost no time. With fights, back and forths, attacks, all that stuff. With each side based upon the clique saying that the other side is either stupid or ignorant or et cetera, or snakes or backstabbers. Like, that sounds like school, but I think that's just that's how we behave. I mean, even in our legal holistic society, like even our legal structures, even within our friendships. I don't know if you've watched Vanderpump Rules. Vanderpump Rules is my guilty pleasure. My wife jokes me about it. When I was at the hospital, I got stuck watching it and ended up buying all the seasons when I got out.
It's like, yeah, we talked about this before. It's like a reality show built around like a cosmetics business or something like this. Like,
it's like all of the people work at a restaurant.
Pardon me.
And it's like Jax, a womanizer. Like when he first started, but it got sadder when he got like 40 years old and he's still behaving the same way. Like, but they have this friendship thing where they're like, you must agree with the crowd. Now, this is not an individual leading. This is basically like a prevalence of a crowd that come up with an idea of things, and then everybody else has to follow that idea of things, so they are attacked by the crowd. It is very bizarre behavior. But that's what they do in school, and that's what it seems like we do in these kind of cliquish environments where your disagreement in and of itself is offensive to us, and it can't be tolerated. But they would complain about it if the same behavior was used against them. It just seems like part and parcel of being a person. I could be wrong, but
we've got another caller, and I don't want to spend the last minutes of our show this week just debating over this stuff before we get to the caller. Very briefly, I think part of it is that I don't think that kids should be forced to deal with the varieties of human nature like they are. I don't think that kids should be like you can put a kid in a wonderful environment where they're forced through various circumstances to confront their weaknesses and to overcome them, to become stronger people, to become more empathetic people, or you can put them in an environment where people hate them irrationally for no reason for years of their life and they can't do anything about it, and they're told that the best thing they can do is to be quiet and to struggle through it. That second system sounds pretty damn rough, and in a lot of cases, pretty damn useless, just painful, and no gain, no.
And accurate. It is accurate. You're right.
Yeah, but do you want to do that? You want to do that to your child? Like, that's the thing, and I don't think a lot of parents do. And so you can say, "Oh, that's just human nature," but no, it's not just human nature. It's what you're actually going to do practically. What's your decision there? And I'm not saying school in every case is bad. We should go to our next call. We can go back and forth on this, but D. calling in from California. D, you're on. What's on your mind?
Hey, guys. This phenomenon you're referring to is really what needed to happen and what does need to happen to move the country forward with older people. And young adults, and getting them to vote for progressive policies, Medicare for all. And,
what phenomenon are you talking about real quick? D, what are you referring to there?
It is a... that sort of pressure with your thinking, and that's kind of, it's almost like a tipping point, a threshold point in the attitude toward different things. So people feel guilty about this lack of wanting to sacrifice for the sake of others, of having health care, and actually acknowledge that people like Joe Biden have only given service to healthcare as a human right, and have never meant it. They've never been sincere about it. I mean, you guys have talked about him as a compulsive liar and a typical politician for a long time. So, but I just want to get, before I lose my train of thought, to that point of messaging, which is, I think, wonderful coming out of this new star, I think, we hope to see shining bright. I don't know if you've heard it, but maybe I expect Jamal has, and there's no honeymoon.
I think I get what you're talking about. We're at a time here, but you're talking about really continuing to put pressure on the Biden administration going into 2021, not giving him a period of reprieve, and ideally that this will create some long-term change. I get where you're going with that. We'll have to pick that up on Monday. We're going to be off tomorrow, folks. I want to close this week out with thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you, engineer Andre. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas. Thank you to our guests. And thank you for listening. We'll be back on Monday, folks. Have a great weekend. Merry Christmas.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. It's near Christmas, so I'm going to wish everybody a Merry Christmas. We're planning to have a contributor appreciation show tomorrow at noon. That's the plan. That's the objective. If anything changes or tweaks, we'll put out like an announcement or something on Twitter. But so far, tomorrow, lazy Christmas Day, but we will end up having a show. So I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, and I want to thank all of you for joining us on the show. By the way, my producer just announced that there's been a Brexit deal that has gone through.
Les négociations ont été très difficiles avec de tels enjeux pour tant de monde.
I have no idea what this woman is saying because I do not speak that language. My mama didn't put me into whatever language school that woman is having. Spanish. So, it's funny. When you learn a foreign language, and you're not great at it, but you think you're generally, moderately okay at it, that you could figure it out if you were in a foreign country of that language. I had maybe 3 or 4 years of Spanish. I was in the Spanish Honor Society, and I realized how little Spanish I knew when we went to like Puerto Rico, and it's like you can't order something off of the menu somewhere. Or I was in, I think it was Egypt. I was on a boat on the Nile, and one of the guys there, Hector was from Buenos Aires, and him and his family members, he had uncles, everybody. They were basically there on a trip to Egypt. And they basically folded me into their wing, even though I didn't speak the language. Hector spoke English, he spoke Hebrew, and he spoke Spanish. And so he was my conduit between communications and everything else. But it's like every third word. And then they speak so fast that you're trying to like pluck the words out as they're saying. It's like, okay. Escucha, I heard that part. Yeah, it gets a little rough. Speaking it and reading it are two very, very different things. All right, I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, I'm going to say Merry Christmas now because I'm probably going to take the rest of the day. But I will see you guys tomorrow, short of anything taking place. Thanks all.